Hey guys, tonight we drift into a story you probably didn't expect when you saw the shiny covers stacked at the grocery checkout. You know the ones, glossy pages, promising perfect hair, an easier casserole, and a life that somehow seems neater, shinier, and endlessly more obedient than yours. As you flip one open in your mind's eye, the paper gives a soft crackle, the ink smells faintly chemical, and under those bright smiles is something less glamorous. Lessons for wives on how to obey. Not shouted, not barked, but whispered through perfume ads, sewing patterns and advice columns that could slip under the radar like a polite cough at a dinner party. And here's the cheeky truth. You probably won't survive this as a 19th century housewife, not because the chores are too much, but because your patience with being told, smile more, might run out faster than the ink in the family fountain pen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing this little constellation of listeners lighting up the map. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glance back at those glossy covers again, the pastel fonts and delicate borders around a woman with an improbable waist and hair that probably required a ladder to construct. The irony here is sharp. While these magazines promised to make life more fun, more stylish, more you, they were slipping in gentle but firm nudges on how to stay in line. Fashion spreads weren't just about skirts, they were guidebooks on how to look pleasing but not threatening. Cookbooks weren't just about food, they were quiet instruction manuals on how to serve without complaint. And you, dear listener, stand in the middle of this printed universe like a time traveler with a flashlight. Imagine picking up an 1890s issue of Ladies' Home Journal. At first glance, it sparkles with advice about velvet gowns and apple pies. But as you read closer, you notice something else, a tone that insists a good wife is cheerful, tidy, and never, ever contradicts her husband. Mainstream historians agree that these magazines sold a vision of the ideal woman along with subscriptions. But here's where it gets quirky. Some issues ran detailed sewing patterns for corsets alongside pages telling wives not to be too demanding. Sewing your obedience directly into your underwear. Talk about multitasking. One of the more fringe tidbits? Early editors knew the power of design. Columns on marriage advice were often tucked next to fashion plates. So the subliminal link was clear. Looking right was tied to behaving right. You didn't just dress the part, you lived the part. Historians still argue whether the magazines were brainwashing women into obedience or simply mirroring what society already expected of them. Like a chicken and egg puzzle, you're left wondering, did the magazine teach obedience or did obedience sell magazines? Now imagine the hum of a household where one of these issues sits open on a polished oak table. A wife might skim recipes for sponge cake while her husband clears his throat, reminding her of his schedule. In that moment, the magazine isn't just paper. It's a silent partner in the conversation, reinforcing the script that says her role is to keep harmony by obeying. And harmony, in this case, means swallowing her irritation when she burns the cake because he needed her to fetch his slippers. The covers themselves were a little deceptive, brightly painted, often with illustrations of serene, doll-like women in sun hats. They suggested joy and lightness. But tucked inside were frequent reminders that a wife's highest achievement was submission. Even the health advice circled back. A woman should preserve her vitality, not for herself, but so she could better serve her family. If that doesn't sound like the worst gym membership ever, I don't know what does. The storytelling here was deliberate, mixing aspiration with discipline. You might feel like you're reading tips on flower arranging, only to realize the tone is gently herding you back toward compliance. This duality, comfort on the surface, control underneath, is what made these magazines so powerful. They weren't overtly shouting, "Obey!" They were simply weaving it into the wallpaper of everyday life. And if you lean closer, you notice the whispering. The layout choices, the editorials, even the reader letters, all aligned to shape not just what women did, but how they thought about themselves. It's like being nudged without knowing you're being nudged. Picture yourself sitting with a steaming cup of tea, eyes half-lidded, lulled by the quiet rhythm of the words, and then realizing the page has just instructed you to never challenge your husband's opinion. A soft voice in print, but a loud echo in the home. So tonight, as you sink deeper into this story, you're already seeing how the glossy covers hid quiet rules. The shimmer of ink, the scent of paper, the playful fonts, all disguises for a cultural instruction manual. And while your eyelids grow heavy, there's something almost hypnotic about the way obedience was dressed up as charm, submission wrapped in satin bows. You may even catch yourself smirking, because in hindsight, it's hard not to laugh a little. The same magazines that told women to obey also sold them corsets that could barely let them breathe. Multitasking misery, style and suffocation in one package deal. And this is just the first page, the first brushstroke of the larger canvas. Behind every glossy cover lay a system teaching women how to live quietly, politely, obediently. You can almost hear the rustle of those pages as you turn them in your imagination, each one sighing a little under the weight of its message. And you, wide awake or half dreaming, get to see the pattern emerging. You ease the page forward in your imagination, and suddenly the room around you fills with the hum of heavy machinery. Printing presses clanking and hissing, the air thick with ink and steam. It's the late 19th century, and you're standing in a bustling publishing house where thousands of copies of women's magazines are sliding hot off the press. The growth of mass publishing was like a tidal wave, and it didn't just wash over politics or industry, it flooded parlors and kitchens too. By the 1830s and 1840s, the cost of paper was dropping, and new printing technologies made it possible to produce magazines cheaply and in quantities that seemed impossible just a few decades earlier. You can almost hear the rollers squeal and the stacks of issues thump into place. For the first time, an ordinary household could afford regular subscriptions. What had once been the luxury of the elite became the nightly reading of the middle class. And guess who publishers decided to target with this brand new toy? Wives. Not just any wives, but the respectable middle-class homemakers who were supposed to embody the new domestic ideal. The publishers knew their audience. Women were seen as keepers of the home, managers of the moral tone of society. So magazines like Godey's Lady's Book in the US or the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine across the pond catered directly to them. Flip through and you'd find a strange mixture: poetry about self-sacrifice, instructions on trimming bonnets, recipes for boiled beef, and moral tales warning what happened when a wife got too clever for her own good. The mainstream historical fact here is that Godey's Lady's Book, edited by Sarah Josepha Hale, was once the most widely circulated magazine in America, reaching more than 150,000 subscribers by the 1860s. That's a serious fan base, especially when you consider that reading material wasn't exactly as plentiful as it is now. You didn't have 3 million blogs and TikTok videos competing for your attention. It was magazines, or silence, and quirky tidbit. Hale, the editor herself, was the same woman who campaigned to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. Imagine that. The woman pushing obedience and domestic virtues in the glossy pages also made sure you'd have turkey on the table every November. Historians still argue whether she genuinely believed women should stay in that narrow lane, or if she was simply packaging what sold. Was she a believer in the cause of obedience, or a savvy businesswoman cashing in on the cultural script? You, of course, standing in the press room, might chuckle, because the magazines didn't just teach obedience, they also gave women a strange kind of collective voice. For the first time, millions of wives across the country were reading the same stories, sharing the same recipes, absorbing the same advice columns. It was like an early form of social media, but with far fewer cat pictures and far more lace doilies. As you picture the pressmen bundling up those issues, you can almost feel the weight of cultural instruction being stacked alongside them. Every copy shipped out wasn't just entertainment, it was a little package of expectations. A wife, picking up her mail, would unwrap it, skim the table of contents, and unknowingly bring the larger cultural conversation right into her sitting room. Of course, the boom had its own contradictions. Some issues carried fiction where a heroine dared to speak back to her husband. only to meet with poetic punishment by the end of the story. Others gave women gentle nudges toward education or charity work, but always framed as acceptable extensions of obedience. Teaching Sunday school? Wonderful. Running for office? Absolutely not. Imagine then a young bride in 1895, flipping through the pages as the lamplight flickers. She reads a piece about keeping her parlour tidy to reflect the orderliness of her soul, and right below it, a pattern for embroidery that reads, "Home Sweet Home." The message is clear. Her worth is bound to her domestic sphere. The house isn't just her duty, it's her destiny. And yet she might find herself secretly enjoying the stories, because even though they dictated roles, they also connected her to a wider world. It was like gossip in print, comforting, instructive, and quietly suffocating. The sheer growth of these magazines made them unavoidable. If you were a woman in a small town, they shaped your horizon. If you were in a big city, they mirrored what your neighbours expected of you. It was like a soft net thrown over society, weaving the ideals of obedience into every parlour, every kitchen, every sewing room. And you, watching from this sleepy distance, can't help but smile at the oddity of it. A medium that promised choice was really narrowing it. A publication that connected women also reminded them to stay small. The printing press thunders on in your imagination, each page sliding out like a subtle command disguised as a suggestion. And all the while, you notice how easy it would have been to absorb these lessons without ever realizing it. The hum of those presses grows softer now, fading like a lullaby, as you picture stacks of freshly printed magazines travelling out by rail, by wagon, by post. They ride through the countryside, carried into kitchens, bedrooms, and drawing rooms, slipping obedience into homes with the same ease as a loaf of bread or a bar of soap. And so, the boom wasn't just economic, it was cultural, domestic, even psychological. It gave women something to hold in their hands, something to fill the quiet evenings, but it also carried that quieter, more insidious message, that a good wife's best skill was knowing how to obey. You step away from the thunder of printing presses and suddenly you're standing in a tidy parlour, lace curtains fluttering at the window, a faint scent of lavender polish clinging to the wooden floorboards. On the side table lies a freshly delivered magazine, its spine not yet cracked. You sit down in the creaky rocking chair and open it, and right away you're greeted by columns that don't just tell you how to hem a dress, but how to shape your entire destiny, to be the domestic angel, forever busy, forever cheerful, forever obedient. This was the real heart of the magazines in their heyday. They weren't selling individual tasks, they were selling an identity. You, the wife, were expected to transform chores into a kind of sacred calling. Dusting wasn't just dusting, it was proof that you cherished your family. Stirring a pot wasn't just stirring, it was a performance of loyalty. Every act of domesticity, down to ironing collars, was repackaged as a badge of moral virtue. Mainstream historians often call this the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood. It was a philosophy that declared women's natural sphere was the home, their moral strength was obedience, and their ultimate achievement was selfless service. And magazines were its megaphone. Imagine glossy pages filled with illustrations of tidy kitchens, angelic mothers, and children who somehow never spilled jam on the rugs. To a tired wife with 6 kids, those images weren't just pretty pictures, they were gentle reminders that she wasn't living up to the ideal unless her smile was as spotless as her windows. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some magazines even published daily schedules for the perfect wife. Picture the timeline: up at dawn to light the fire, cook breakfast, brush the children's hair, polish the furniture, write thank you notes, prepare dinner, smile prettily when the husband walks in. And, oh yes, be sure you look fresh enough to host company if he brings a colleague home unannounced. It was like a Fitbit schedule, but instead of tracking your steps, it was tracking how thoroughly you erased yourself for the sake of others. Historians still argue whether these schedules were intended as realistic guides or simply exaggerated ideals meant to inspire. Either way, women were left in a bind, fall short, and you felt like a failure. succeed, and you were too exhausted to notice. It's like being given a board game where every roll of the dice lands you back at square one. You might picture yourself trying it for a day. You wake up early, stifle a yawn, follow the magazine's instructions. Bed made so tight a coin could bounce, children scrubbed until they smell like soap factories, pies cooling on the windowsill. Then the magazine tosses in that charming reminder. A cheerful disposition is the most important ingredient in any home. Translation? Even if your feet ache and the stew has boiled over, don't forget to smile. And smile you would, though maybe through clenched teeth, because the unspoken rule was clear. Your worth as a wife wasn't measured by your dreams but by your chores. The more invisible your labor, the more valuable you supposedly were. The magazines rarely printed articles about women writing novels or running businesses. Instead, they lavished praise on the woman who could juggle 10 chores in silence. There's something almost theatrical about it. You can imagine a stage where the domestic angel performs day after day. The props, an apron, a rolling pin, a mop. The line, "Yes, dear," and "Of course, dear." The applause, a quiet nod from her husband, maybe a brief mention in a letter to his mother about how she keeps the house so well. Hardly a standing ovation, but here's where the humor sneaks in. Sometimes the magazines accidentally made the angel look more like a machine. One 19th century housekeeping guide earnestly suggested women clean door hinges weekly for a truly polished home. Door hinges, as if neighbors were peeking into parlors gasping at the scandal of a slightly squeaky hinge. You can almost hear yourself muttering, "Sure, let me just iron the moon while I'm at it." Still, the message was relentless. Being constantly busy wasn't just about keeping house, it was about keeping obedient. The logic was simple. A wife with no free time had no time to question. If every waking moment was filled with chores, recipes, sewing, and smiling, she had little room left for rebellion. In that sense, busyness was obedience dressed as productivity. And yet some women might have found comfort in these pages. They offered structure in a chaotic world, a sense of purpose in endless tasks. Reading them, you could almost feel you were part of a larger sisterhood of housewives, all striving for the same spotless parlor and the same eternal smile. Whether it was empowering or enslaving, that's the debate historians are still having. As you rock gently in that chair, the magazine slipping lower in your lap, you begin to notice how heavy the expectation is. The room feels stifling, the air perfumed with polish and obligation, and you can almost sense the exhaustion of those women, forever busy, forever tidying, forever serving, while being told this was their destiny. But the rocking is soothing, the rhythm's slow, and even as you picture the never-ending chores, the cadence of the story begins to lull you. The domestic angel, wings clipped, still flutters in the pages, reminding you that busyness wasn't just survival, it was obedience by another name. You leave the tidy parlor behind, and in your mind's hand you carry the same glossy issue, its pages fluttering like wings as you walk. A breeze catches it open, not to recipes this time, not to tidy schedules, but to something shinier. Full-page illustrations of gowns, hats, gloves, and shoes sprawl before you in color plates that shimmer with ink. Fashion spreads. At first glance, they look harmless. Pretty dresses, decorative bonnets, the sort of thing you'd expect women to sigh over. But the longer you stare, the clearer it becomes. These weren't just about clothes. They were obedience lessons stitched into satin. You can almost hear the crinkle of the paper as you smooth it flat, eyes wandering across a gown described as suitable for the demure hostess. The language itself was a leash. To be fashionable wasn't only to be stylish, it was to signal that you understood your place. Dresses were advertised as modest yet appealing, or graceful without being gaudy. Little phrases that reminded you not to attract too much attention. Heaven forbid your hemline suggest independence. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Victorian and early 20th century women's magazines devoted entire sections to fashion plates, and these weren't just random drawings. They often came from Paris ateliers, carefully curated to embody ideals of femininity that reinforced obedience and gentility. If men had uniforms of authority, suits, medals, military dress, then women had uniforms of submission disguised as lace and ribbons. And now the quirky tidbit: some magazines actually included detailed fold-out patterns so readers could sew the outfits themselves at home. Imagine that. Hours hunched over fabric, pricking your fingers, only to emerge with a dress designed not to make you comfortable, but to make him proud. And if your stitches weren't straight enough, the magazine would be ready to scold you with a cheerful reminder that a wife's diligence shows in the seams. You can't help but smirk. It's obedience in cotton, quite literally woven into your wardrobe. Historians still argue whether these fashion pages gave women creative expression or boxed them in. On one hand, designing and sewing clothes could be an art form, a tiny rebellion of flair. On the other, the finished product was rarely for the woman herself. It was to meet an external standard of what a proper wife should look like. Did fashion liberate or enslave? The jury's still out, and likely will be until someone invents a time machine to ask those seamstresses directly. Picture yourself stepping into a department store in 1905, clutching your latest issue. The mannequins wear the same outfits you saw in print, and other women murmur approval as they point at a modest collar or a well-fitted skirt. You realize the magazine isn't just paper, it's a map guiding the entire marketplace. The colors, the cuts, the phrases, charming, refined, not too daring, all designed to remind wives that fashion was obedience stitched in silk. Even the accessories whispered rules. Gloves weren't just to keep your hands warm, they signaled gentility. Hats weren't just to block the sun, they reminded you to take up space politely, not boldly. And corsets, those architectural nightmares of whalebone and lace, weren't just for shape. They were literal cages. Crocodile dung sunscreen may have been a weird experiment in ancient Egypt, but corsets? They were the modern equivalent of strapping yourself in so society could breathe easier while you didn't. As you trail your fingers over the imagined paper, the fashion spreads feel almost hypnotic. Page after page insists that the right outfit is a moral choice. You don't just wear a dress, you wear loyalty, humility, modesty. A bold pattern might hint at disobedience. A high collar whispers that you know your place. The clothing becomes a second skin of control, one you button up yourself each morning. Yet tucked between the lines, you catch glimpses of sly humour. Some readers joked in their letters about sewing sleeves so tight they couldn't lift their arms high enough to scold the children. Others mocked fashion plates that seemed impossible to wear in real life, especially when your day involved scrubbing laundry on a washboard instead of strolling through manicured gardens. Still, the magazines persisted. They kept presenting fashion not as choice, but as duty. And you, drifting through these glossy spreads, can sense the weight of the unspoken message. To be fashionable was to be obedient, to dress was to conform, and to stray too far from the script was to risk whispers at church or the neighbour's side-eye at market. The pages fold shut with a sigh, as though the magazine itself knows it has pressed a heavy truth onto you, and you, rocking gently between wakefulness and sleep, feel the echo of satin skirts rustling in the quiet room, carrying with them not just beauty, but a burden stitched in thread. The glossy pages rustle again, and this time the scent drifting from them isn't perfume or ink, but something warm and familiar. Cinnamon, nutmeg, butter, melting in pastry. You've landed in the recipe section, the coziest corner of any women's magazine, where steaming pies and bubbling stews beckon with promises of domestic bliss. At first it feels safe here, almost comforting, but as you read closer you realize the recipes come with more than measurements. They carry morals baked right into the margins. Take, for example, the simple sponge cake. The instructions read smoothly. Beat the eggs until light, fold the sugar gently, bake until golden. But right below, a little note. A well-made sponge is the mark of a patient wife, careful not to rush life's duties. You blink, stir, and suddenly realize you're not just baking dessert, you're being reminded that your temperament should rise as evenly as your cake. Mainstream historians often point out that recipes in these magazines weren't just about food, they were coded lessons, reinforcing the idea that a wife's obedience was best demonstrated in the kitchen, Providing meals wasn't only nourishment, it was proof of loyalty, proof of subservience, proof of knowing your place. The ideal wife didn't just serve dinner, she served her husband's authority along with it. Now for a quirky tidbit, some 1920s magazines actually published husband-pleasing menus, complete with suggested phrases a wife might say while presenting each dish. Imagine carrying in a roast and cheerfully quoting the margin. "Dearest, I prepared this with your comfort foremost in mind." It's like dinner theatre, but the script never changes. You may laugh softly now, picturing yourself fumbling through a soufflé while remembering to rehearse the right lines. Historians still argue whether women genuinely believed these moralized recipes, or if they read them with a wink, aware of the subtext, but amused enough to play along. Were wives sincerely measuring devotion in teaspoons, or were they just hungry and tired, letting the magazine preach while they improvised with whatever ingredients were actually on hand? Picture a farmhouse kitchen in 1910. The wood stove hisses, pots rattle, and a young wife consults her magazine with furrowed brow. She's trying to follow the directions for a custard, but the eggs are fresh from the coop and stubbornly won't whip right. At that moment, the children bicker in the corner, and her husband clears his throat from the other room. The page whispers its verdict. A calm wife keeps her household in order. And she sighs, whisking faster, knowing the custard is less about taste and more about proving patience. The moral layering went further. Instructions on preserving fruit often carried subtle warnings about preserving harmony. Directions for kneading dough doubled as allegories for kneading obedience into daily life. Even the humble casserole was dressed up as a metaphor. Slow, steady, reliable, never fiery, unpredictable, never unpredictable, just like the perfect wife. Of course, not every reader swallowed this whole. Some women wrote letters joking about burned biscuits or failed puddings, hinting at rebellion through culinary disaster. One even quipped in print that her charred stew was a protest against long sermons on duty. You can't help but chuckle at that, turning dinner into an edible manifesto. But even humour couldn't erase the broader impact these recipes shaped generations, embedding obedience into muscle memory with every stir of the spoon. The act of cooking became ritualized submission, a daily prayer whispered through flour and butter. And the magazines? They sat like silent priests on the counter, guiding each motion, each seasoning, each nod of deference. Now, imagine yourself trying one of these moralized recipes late at night. You tie on an apron, flip to the page, and begin. As the kitchen warms and the smells rise, you feel lulled into rhythm. Chop, stir, taste, smile. Without realizing it, you're following the same script countless women before you absorbed. And even as you grow drowsy, the rhythm continues, obedience disguised as nourishment, submission simmering alongside supper. You lean back now, the imaginary spoon resting in your hand, and the magazine slips shut again. The warmth lingers, fragrant and heavy, leaving behind the realization that these weren't just meals, they were lessons served on porcelain plates, spiced with sugar and silence. You let the recipe pages flutter closed, the imagined scent of nutmeg fading, and suddenly another sound rises, a faint scratching like a pen nib dragging across paper. You lean closer, and the magazine opens to the letters to the editor section, where real women's voices whisper up from the page. Here, wives from towns and farms across the country poured out their thoughts, questions about etiquette, confessions about loneliness, little bursts of rebellion disguised as polite inquiries. You read one aloud in your head. "Dear Madam, my husband insists that I wear my hair only in a bun, though I find it uncomfortable. Am I wrong to prefer another style?" The editor's reply is printed neatly beneath. A dutiful wife considers her husband's wishes above her own comfort, for harmony is worth a minor sacrifice. There it is again, obedience, reinforced not just by experts, but by the voices of women themselves, handed back with a varnish of authority. Mainstream historians remind us that these letters to the editor were sometimes authentic, sometimes heavily edited, and occasionally invented altogether. They created the illusion of a community, millions of women writing in, sharing struggles, seeking wisdom. Whether authentic or staged, the effect was the same. The reader was reminded she wasn't alone in being asked to obey. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Some magazines actually published letters from women begging for strategies to deal with disobedient servants or stubborn children, only to be redirected with the advice, remember, the best way to lead is through example. Show obedience to your husband, and others in your household will naturally follow. It's like being told that your casserole rebellion won't just ruin dinner, it'll topple the entire domestic order. Historians still argue whether these letters gave women an outlet for their frustrations or simply tightened the leash by echoing the same lessons back at them. Were the magazines offering a safe place to vent, or were they performing a sly trick, letting women speak, only to gently steer them back into line? Imagine you're the one writing a letter. The house is quiet at last, the children asleep, your husband snores rumbling from the next room. You light a small lamp, dip your pen in ink, and pour your heart into words. Maybe you admit you feel invisible. Maybe you confess that you secretly want more than cooking and cleaning. You fold the paper neatly, send it off, and wait weeks for a reply. When the magazine arrives, your eyes skim the page in anticipation. And there it is, your question reframed, your yearning tucked back into obedience, your voice polished into something more acceptable. It's both heartbreaking and darkly funny. Picture a woman asking, "How can I keep from being so tired all the time?" And the editor replying, "Tidy your kitchen earlier and fatigue will melt away." You can't help but grin at the absurdity because no amount of polishing cutlery will erase exhaustion. But in print, the illusion held. Some letters hinted at rebellion. A widow once asked if it was truly improper for her to manage her own finances. The editor, cautious, answered that while some widows did such things, most found it better for peace of mind to rely on a male relative's guidance. Subtext? Don't get any ideas, dear. Another letter described a wife who preferred to read novels rather than embroider in the evening. The editor praised her love of learning, then quickly added, "But moderation is key, lest the home suffer." Translation: by all means, read your book, just don't burn the roast. And yet these letters carried something powerful. They revealed cracks in the glossy facade. Beneath the magazine's polished tone, you can almost hear the sighs of women who were tired of smiling, who wanted more than moralized casseroles or spotless hinges. Even if their voices were trimmed and softened before printing, they slipped through the cracks, reminding us that women weren't simply passive sponges soaking up obedience. They were thinking, questioning, pushing, if only by asking polite questions in looping handwriting. Now, as you set the magazine aside in your mind's eye, you hear the soft scratching fade, replaced by the faint hum of silence. And in that silence, you sense the tension that pulsed through every issue. The magazine offered women a place to speak, but only within the boundaries of obedience, like a parlor where everyone whispers, but only about acceptable topics. The letters close with a sigh, and you, drifting between wakefulness and drowsiness, can almost see the pile of envelopes stacked high on an editor's desk, each one carrying the same hidden question: is there room for me beyond obedience? You set aside the stack of reader letters, their ink still lingering in your imagination, when the magazine opens again, and this time greets you with an entirely different voice. It's the crisp authority of the doctor's corner, those little columns printed with the confidence of medical men who likely never scrubbed a dish in their lives. The advice, though dressed in clinical precision, almost always circled back to the same refrain. Women were delicate, fragile, in need of guidance, and therefore better off obeying. You picture one such column. A wife must take care not to exert herself unduly, lest her nerves become strained. A calm disposition promotes not only her health, but her husband's peace of mind. There it is again, the medical diagnosis as moral instruction. Your aching back isn't just fatigue, it's a signal you should smile more, argue less, and of course let your husband make the real decisions. Mainstream historians remind us that these so-called medical columns weren't peer-reviewed by any modern standard. They often came from physicians who wrote part-time for magazines, men steeped in Victorian notions of gender difference. Women were told their bodies were naturally weaker, their minds less suited for intellectual exertion. Illnesses like hysteria were attributed to disobedience or a wife stepping outside her domestic sphere. If you wanted a prescription, you might be told to rest quietly, stop worrying, and perhaps take up embroidery. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some doctors' columns genuinely prescribed things like a brisk walk while thinking cheerful thoughts, or a glass of warm milk before bed, as cures for ailments ranging from headaches to melancholy. One even suggested that a woman feeling restless at night should request her husband's company, for his steady presence will calm her. Translation: you don't need aspirin, you need obedience therapy. Historians still argue whether these columns were cynical manipulations by patriarchal editors or simply reflections of the medical ignorance of the time. Did doctors truly believe that obedience was the cure-all, or were they repackaging cultural control as health advice? Either way, the effect was the same. Medicine became another channel for telling women to stay quiet, stay cheerful, and stay home. Imagine yourself in 1902 seated at a kitchen table with the magazine spread wide. You've had a splitting headache all morning from wrangling laundry, but the doctor's column insists that women's pain often stems from an overactive imagination. You roll your eyes, though quietly, because heaven forbid you worsen the condition by brooding. The advice suggests lying down with lavender on your pillow and letting your husband know you are grateful for his steadying influence. You chuckle in disbelief because if you told him about your headache, his only advice might be, "Don't make noise while I read the paper." Some wives followed the advice dutifully, others ignored it, and a few wrote back with mockery thinly disguised as deference. One letter asked if it was excessive for a wife to feel faint after cleaning 12 windows in a day. The editor's reply: perhaps she exerted herself unnecessarily. Moderation in household tasks ensures a calm spirit. You almost laugh aloud. It's like saying, "Stop fainting so dramatically, just polish fewer pains." And yet, for women of the time, these columns carried weight. Doctors were authority figures, their printed words gospel. To read that a medical expert believed obedience fostered health could shape how wives thought about their own bodies. Your fatigue wasn't just tired muscles, it was a moral failing. Your sadness wasn't depression, it was lack of cheer. And the cure wasn't rest, not really, it was obedience. You picture a woman folding the magazine shut, sighing. She smooths her apron and goes back to stirring the pot, the doctor's words echoing in her head. She doesn't feel better, not really, but the advice lingers anyway, and you, hovering as an observer, can almost hear her whisper under her breath, "Perhaps I'm just tired," not disobedient. A quiet, almost rebellious thought. The doctor's corner fades now, its clinical tone dissolving into the hush of your room. What remains is the memory of how authority, dressed in a white coat and printed on glossy paper, became another way to preach obedience. Softly, firmly, medically. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize the prescription was never about the body. It was about keeping wives in their place, disguised as caring advice. The doctor's corner fades from view, and as you flip the magazine forward again, you stumble into another sort of guide. These aren't medical prescriptions or moralized recipes. They're practical-sounding tips, lists, and step-by-step instructions. Titles like 10 Ways to Keep Your Home Cheerful or How to Welcome Your Husband with Grace. At first, they seem harmless enough. Who doesn't like a good tip? But as your eyes trace the lines, you realize they aren't really about dusting or ironing. They're tests, husband tests, where the measure of your worth is how satisfied he feels when he walks through the door. One article might advise, when your husband returns from work, greet him warmly, offer him his slippers, and refrain from burdening him with household troubles until he has finished his supper. It sounds almost sweet until you catch the subtext. Your exhaustion, your worries, your day's chaos, all wait silently in the corner because the true performance begins only when he arrives. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Early 20th century magazines routinely published these household guides, and many were structured as checklists. Wives were encouraged to evaluate themselves by questions like, "Does your husband often smile at you when he enters the room?" Or, "Have you kept your voice calm in the face of his irritability?" They were subtle but relentless, teaching obedience by turning it into a game of constant self-monitoring. Now for the quirky tidbit, some magazines even printed miniature report cards for wives. A wife could rate herself on categories such as tidiness, gentleness, pleasing cookery, and, this one's real, silent listening. Imagine grading yourself an A in laundry, but a C in keeping your opinions to yourself. You laugh softly because it feels like the world's most condescending school exam, where the prize for good marks is permission to keep doing chores. Historians still argue whether these guides reflected genuine advice for better marriages or simply reinforced power imbalances. Were they well-meaning tools to smooth domestic life, or were they disguised obedience drills that kept wives forever second-guessing themselves? The debate continues like a coin flipped in slow motion, never landing squarely. Picture yourself in 1935, seated at the kitchen table with one of these guides open. You've had a long day scrubbing floors, but the list reminds you, a weary face is not a welcoming one. Take a few minutes to powder your nose before your husband arrives. So you wash your hands, pat your cheeks, and try to look less tired than you feel. When he comes home, you smile, though your arms ache. And maybe he doesn't notice. And maybe he just sits down with the paper. But the magazine has already graded you, your silent obedience, the only passing score. Sometimes the tips veered into the absurd. Always arrange fresh flowers on the dining table to maintain cheer. Lovely advice until you remember you live 3 miles from town and it's the middle of winter. Or polish his shoes weekly as a sign of devotion. That one might make you chuckle. After all, who exactly benefits from sparkling shoes? Him on the street? Or you for avoiding another scolding? And yet, for all their silliness, these tips held real power. They weren't framed as rules, but as gentle suggestions, the kind you absorb without noticing. And soon enough, a wife might find herself measuring her success, not in her own joy, but in the curve of her husband's smile, or the absence of his frown. You linger on the image of a magazine folded open on the counter, its corner curling with the steam from a boiling pot. The checklist waits patiently, silent and judgmental. A wife glances at it, sighs, and mentally tallies her marks for the day. The list doesn't scold out loud, it doesn't have to. The obedience is baked into the act of counting. And as you close the magazine in your mind, the sound of those lists lingers like the faint ticking of a clock, constant, steady, a reminder that every moment in the home could be measured, graded, tested, not by love or laughter, but by obedience disguised as household efficiency. You flip the magazine, and the mood shifts like theatre lights dimming. One moment you're in the kitchen, the next you're pulled into a story that reads like a lullaby with teeth. Serialized fiction fills the spine of many women's magazines, chapter after chapter of romances, moral tales, and melodramas designed to keep you buying the next issue. At first, they seem like harmless entertainment, an escape from starch and soot, but when you look closer, the plots have a pattern. Heroines who question authority, who insist on speaking up, who choose uncertain paths, often find themselves softened, shamed, or conveniently sidelined by narrative owners who like tidy endings as much as tidy parlours. The moral is rarely subtle. Obedience tends to protect you, disobedience tends to hurt you, or at least make for a very long, moralistic subplot. The mainstream fact is simple. Serialized fiction was a staple of 19th and early 20th century periodicals. Novels and stories appeared in installments in papers and magazines across Britain and America, and women's periodicals were no exception. These serials drew in readers week after week, binding them to a rhythm of awaiting the next installment as eagerly as waiting for a neighbour's gossip. You, settling down with a kerosene lamp or an electric bulb depending on the decade, would let a cliffhanger pull you breathless from mending to melodrama. It was a subscription-based emotional roller coaster without the seatbelt. Now the quirky tidbit. Editors often commission didactic tales, stories explicitly designed to teach, where domestic virtue is pitted against modern temptation. One popular trope involved a spirited young wife who, tempted by education or city lights, stumbles into social trouble, then returns chastened to the hearth with a baker's dozen lessons folded under her apron. Sometimes the author and the editor seem to conspire to make the heroine's mistakes extra theatrical. Misplaced letters, overheard conversations, a rival with impeccable eyebrows who always looked scandalous in the right light. It's as if the fiction department had a checklist: 1, temptation; 2, error; 3, humbling; 4, reconciliation. Repeat until subscriptions rise. You can almost hear the typesetter snickering. Historians still argue whether these serials were instruments of ideological control or simply reflections of anxieties already present in society. Did the fiction shape behavior, teaching obedience by punishing nonconformity, or did it merely reward readers' expectations for moral closure in a tumultuous world? The debate hangs in the air like steam from a just-poured pot of tea. Comforting, a little bitter, and impossible to ignore. You, being the curious kind, smell the ink and start reading a serialized tale. The heroine is introduced as clever and restless. She sketches designs for a little business on the sly and dreams of lecture halls. At first she's charming, with a laugh like tinkling cutlery and opinions like freshly peeled apples, sharp, bright. But the author quickly introduces the warning signs: a hushed whisper in church, a neighbour's eyebrow raised like punctuation, and a man who will always know better because the narrative insists so. By the third installment she has erred in a way that could have been avoided by simply accepting a better pie recipe. You smile and roll your eyes. The predictable misfortune is almost affectionate in its choreography. Joke 1 slides in. You think, if only she'd read the magazine's recipe section, she'd have known a good pie solves many domestic crises. There's a sly craft to this storytelling. Plots were often moralized through domestic metaphors. A neglected garden becomes a neglected marriage. A stray stitch becomes evidence of moral slippage. The language turns housekeeping into morality play. Characters who questioned their roles often encountered narrative devices that made their trials both dramatic and didactic. An inheritance lost, a suitor deceived, a reputation marred by gossip. The message is as clear as a bell. Step out of line, and the plot will correct you. For many readers, such stories served as cautionary tales. For others, they were vicarious thrills, a safe way to explore rebellious thoughts while folding linens. Yet even within those pages you find flickers of something else. Women characters who stealthily defy norms not by grand gestures but by tiny acts of agency. A heroine might start a secret savings account, or read late at night by lamplight, or refuse to marry a man who offers only comfort and not conversation. Those small rebellions are often slyly celebrated in passing, an author's wink hidden in a parenthetical remark, before the story reins them back toward propriety. It's a complicated dance. The serials feed both caution and curiosity, seducing readers with possibilities they could never publicly endorse. One of the lighter oddities is how often household objects become spokespeople for morality. A cracked teacup is practically a sacrificial altar to the drama of the next chapter. A misplaced bonnet triggers entire scenes of misunderstanding and at least one reconciliatory sonnet. Joke 2. You start to expect that the real antagonist is always a domestic prop. Someone should patent the melodramatic casserole. You, reading in bed, laugh softly because the stakes are so small and yet written as if empires hang in the balance. Serialized fiction also provided a peculiar kind of collective dreaming. Readers wrote letters lamenting cliffhangers as if the characters were neighbours. Book clubs of the era, if you can call their equivalents that, gossiped about characters' morals and motives, and sometimes readers would pressure editors to continue a storyline that favoured a particular suitor. The serialized novel created conversation and community, an early fandom fueled by moral outrage and domestic curiosity. That sense of being part of a monthly ritual is part of what made magazines so intimate and influential, but the influence cuts both ways. Fiction could enforce norms by dramatizing the consequences of defiance, yet it could also sow seeds of dissent by portraying women's interior lives with empathy. Authors sometimes slipped through criticism in the margins, a sympathetic description of a woman's late-night reading habit, a passing observation about the narrowness of her social sphere. Such moments could kindle a reader's imagination, lighting small rebellions that might never be voiced aloud. And so you, reading the serial under a blanket with a half-empty teacup at your side, feel both soothed and unsettled. The story comforts you with its predictable moral arc while whispering, beneath the folding lines, the thought that a different ending is possible. Joke 3 sneaks in. You think of writing your own installment, The Wife Who Kept the Receipt Book, and giggle at the idea that a ledger could make better drama than any lover's quarrel. As the installment closes, the heroine faces a choice that readers will debate until the next issue. Accept a life of neat compliance or risk something untidy and new. The cliffhanger tugs at you not because you care solely for the plot, but because these fictional trials map onto the quiet anxieties of real women about independence, respect, and the cost of crossing invisible lines. You close the magazine, the paper whispering like a stage curtain falling. The serialized fiction has done its work. It entertained, instructed, and nudged the boundaries of what could be imagined. The stories were sometimes stern tutors, sometimes mischievous companions, and always a part of the broader instruction manual disguised as leisure reading. You turn off the lamp in your mind, and the cliffhanger lingers, a small ember that might warm or burn, depending on whether you let it. You let the serial fiction fade, its cliffhanger still echoing in your mind, and the next page is open to something shinier, advertising spreads, bursting with flourishes of ink and bold typefaces. Here, you're greeted not by heroines or housewives, but by soapboxes, stove polish, corset brands, and patent tonics, all gleaming under slogans so cheerful they almost sing. At first, they seem like ordinary promotions, buy this, try that, but if you tilt your head just slightly, you notice the invisible leash woven through every ad. It wasn't just products being sold, it was obedience itself packaged with a smile. Mainstream historians remind us that the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a golden age for advertising. Magazines were sustained by ads, and women's periodicals in particular became laboratories for marketing psychology. Advertisers knew their audience, wives controlled the household budget, so targeting them meant shaping not only what they bought, but how they behaved. Every soap ad, every coffee tin, every sewing machine came tied to a little moral. Be a better wife, a cleaner mother, a more obedient partner, and you'll earn approval. Now the quirky tidbit, one famous soap campaign in the 1910s included before and after drawings, not of the laundry, but of the wife herself. In the before, she looked harried and sloppy. In the after, radiant and submissively smiling, with the caption implying her husband's affection had been restored thanks to clean collars. The soap didn't just wash stains, it scrubbed her into obedience. You can't help but laugh quietly at that. Imagine laundry detergent today, promising not brighter whites, but fewer arguments at dinner. Historians still argue whether these ads genuinely manipulated women or simply reflected expectations already drilled into them. Did wives see the obedience hook and accept it, or did they roll their eyes, buy the soap anyway and move on? The truth probably lies in between. Ads worked because they echoed what society already whispered, reinforcing obedience until it felt like common sense. Picture yourself leafing through a 1925 issue of Ladies' Home Journal. On one page, an oven ad boasts, "He'll smile when dinner is on time." On the next, a corset brand promises, "A wife's duty is grace, comfort, and charm. Our stays assure all three." You chuckle, imagining modern readers choking on their coffee if they saw an ad like that today. Yet for women then, these glossy promises blurred seamlessly into daily life. Buying the right oven wasn't just convenience, it was proof of loyalty. Wearing the right corset wasn't just style, it was obedience stitched under your dress. The strangest ads sometimes linger the longest. One tonic promised nerves calmed, complexion softened, husband pleased. Another advised wives to polish the family's shoes weekly to keep respect shining. You can almost hear yourself mutter, "Right, because nothing says marital harmony like spotless shoelaces." The humour is obvious now, but in their time, these messages slipped under the skin. And beyond humour, there's something unsettling in how the ads equated consumption with morality. To fail at housework wasn't just laziness, it was disobedience. To choose the wrong soap wasn't just bad shopping, it was betrayal. Each purchase became a tiny vote for submission, a ritual act of keeping the household hierarchy intact. Imagine the rhythm of it. A wife clipping coupons, circling ads, dutifully buying the endorsed flower brand because the page promised peaceful dinners. She lugs it home, bakes with it, and when her husband eats quietly without complaint, she feels vindicated, not by his words, but by the ad's prophecy. In that moment, the magazine has succeeded. It has made obedience marketable, measurable, purchasable. And yet the edges of resistance glimmer faintly. Letters occasionally surfaced mocking the ads. One reader joked she would need to buy 100 bars of soap before her husband could be so perpetually cheerful. Another scoffed that corsets could ensnare the ribs but not the spirit. Small cracks, faint jokes, but cracks nonetheless. Still, the overwhelming tone was clear. Advertising became a velvet leash, a chain so soft it felt like satin, tugging wives toward submission while promising sparkle and shine. The jingles echo in your ears even now. Obedience is charm. Charm is product. Product is happiness. The formula was simple and devastatingly effective. As the magazine pages fold shut again in your mind, you're left with a final image. Not a corset or a soap ad, but a smiling woman in an illustration, her head tilted just so, her eyes lowered in modesty. The caption reads, "Every wife's success begins with pleasing him." And you, sinking a little deeper into the drowsy quiet, feel the tug of that velvet leash, a whisper of obedience, sold at the price of a bar of soap. You hear a polite knock on the magazine's door, soft as a teacup tapping a saucer, and when you open it, you find pamphlets, placards, and neat signatures folded between the fashion plates. The suffragists have arrived, and their presence makes the glossy pages sit up straighter, as if someone has just mentioned politics at a garden party. For decades, these magazines taught women how to be small and serviceable. Now a new voice asks a sharper question. What if obedience is not the only path to respect? The room holds its breath for a moment and you feel the pages tremble. Mainstream historians note a tangible shift. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, suffrage movements in the United States and Britain were compelling many publications to address women's civic claims. Some periodicals openly supported votes for women, others condemned it, but most tried to walk a careful middle line, publishing temperance articles and school reform features while avoiding overt calls for political rebellion. The result was a patchwork of content that mixed domestic advice with tentative political engagement, a kind of polite editorial two-step. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some magazines literally domesticized the movement, printing knitting patterns for banners, recipes labeled campaign sandwiches, or instructions on how to press a sash without wrinkling its slogan. Picture a rally where the air smells of flour and slogans. The revolution for a spell resembled a church bazaar with better placards. It's almost funny to imagine polite protests punctuated by the clink of teacups. Historians still argue whether this balance meant magazines were leading women toward political consciousness or merely reflecting a change already simmering among readers. In short, did the press push suffrage, or did editors follow the tide? The answer is contested and stubbornly unresolved, and that open question keeps the conversation interesting. You leaf through a 1912 issue. The cover shows a demure woman in a sensible hat, but inside an essay gently suggests that civic engagement could be an extension of maternal care, vote to protect children's schools, the piece implies, and you act as a moral guardian for the community. The language is careful, testing the temperature of readers' teacups before plunging the spoon in. It reassures you can still be a good wife and help the town council at the same time. That caution was strategic. Editors wanted to keep subscribers placid, not provoked, A strident editorial might cost circulation or anger advertisers. So activism got domesticated, presented as respectable service. One profile praised a woman who organized evening classes for workers and framed her leadership as an extension of her nurturing instincts. It read almost like a recipe: a pinch of reform, a tablespoon of charity, stir gently so the gravy of public life doesn't curdle the domestic pudding. Imagine a reading circle in a small parlour. Women sit by lamplight, the magazine on the tea table between them, and a cautious article about school boards sparks conversation. One woman says, voting could help the schools, while another worries about gossip at church. The magazine has done its work. It opened a window without knocking the house down. Networks form quietly. Women who sew banners also exchange opinions. And, between stitches, they learn organizational skills that later prove useful on doorsteps and at meetings. Because the voices were mixed, the pages hosted a rhetorical tug-of-war. Conservative columnists warned that politics would sully family harmony, while reform-minded writers argued that women's moral authority would civilize public life. Editors often printed both perspectives, letting readers encounter counter-arguments side by side. It's almost comical to imagine a reader's tea interrupted by two op-eds, one titled "Why She Must Stay Home" and the other "Why She Must Vote to Improve Schools." The domestic ritual becomes a debating society. Yet the visual strategies mattered. Photographs of suffragists were often chosen to reassure. Gloves, sensible coats, composed expressions, images that resisted opponents' caricatures of shrieking crowds. By presenting activists as respectable, magazines normalized participation. Activism looked less like an uproar and more like a civic committee meeting. The pretend gentility calmed readers' nerves while widening the horizon of what women might do. Sometimes magazines surprised their audiences with real sympathy. A thoughtful profile of an educator advocating legal reform might appear without moralizing tone, offering readers new language for old frustrations. Other times, the same title printed a short story where a woman's public ambitions lead to friction, serialized fiction doing its old trick of warning through narrative. The result was dissonant. Encouragement and caution braided together. You might find the whole thing oddly funny. Revolution gets knitted, sugared and ironed before it goes out. The suffragist who sews her sash between mending socks becomes an emblem of patient persistence. A small joke pops up in your head. Perhaps the best banner maker makes the best organizer, because she never misses a stitch. The humor is gentle, but the consequence is real. Skills learned in the parlor translate to political competence. Over time, the steady drip of reportage, profiles and classifieds that mention meetings began to normalize women's public presence. Magazines acted like slow-acting yeast, tiny edits, tiny endorsements, shifts in tone that expanded readers' imagination about possible roles. Historians still debate the size of that effect. Some argue magazines were crucial socializing tools preparing women for civic life. Others insist that street meetings, pamphlets and direct action mattered more. Either way, the pages had changed character. They no longer sang only a single refrain. You close the issue and feel the polite knock lingering in the quiet. The arrival of suffragists didn't dismantle the old manuals overnight, but it made the glossy script tremble. And tremors, you know, sometimes precede earthquakes. You smile softly, smile one, and tuck away the image of obedience and aspiration sharing the same bed for a while, trading covers politely as they worked out their differences. You let the polite knock of suffragists fade, and now the pages rustle to something louder, sharper, like a brass bell rung in a quiet room. This section of the magazine is filled with warnings, dire pronouncements, and scolding headlines. The tone is urgent, breathless, almost theatrical. The modern girl, threat to the home, or flappers bring ruin to marriage. It's the moral panic pages, those glossy soapboxes where editors wagged fingers at young women daring to step out of line. Mainstream historians note that throughout the 1910s, 1920s, and even into the 1950s, women's magazines regularly ran articles warning about new types of young women, the bicycle-riding girl of the 1890s, the cigarette-smoking flapper of the 20s, the career-minded secretary of the 40s. Each generation brought fresh panic, and each article hummed the same tune. Too much independence would collapse the family, corrode morality, and leave women lonely. Now, for a quirky tidbit, one 1920s piece actually warned that jazz music could infect a woman's temperament, causing her to rebel against her proper sphere. The advice? Avoid too many dances lest the syncopation shuffle you into disobedience. You might laugh softly, picturing some poor husband glaring at a trumpet player, muttering that brass instruments were corrupting his wife's ironing schedule. Historians still argue whether these articles genuinely swayed women or were mostly preaching to the choir. Were they influential tools of control, or just echo chambers reassuring older readers that their disapproval was justified? The question lingers like a stubborn echo at the bottom of a stairwell. You imagine flipping through a 1930s issue and landing on a bold headline, "Is your daughter losing her modesty?" The piece laments short skirts, cinema romances, and young women who dare to read novels before finishing their darning. The text is laced with anxious metaphors. A home is a fortress, independence is a crack in the wall, and disobedience is the storm pounding at the gates. It's melodrama in print, designed to make mothers clutch pearls and daughters glance guiltily at their hemlines. Sometimes the warnings veered into comedy by accident. An etiquette column in the 1940s scolded women who chose trousers over skirts for convenience, suggesting this would lead to a decline in feminine grace and therefore marital happiness. You smirk at the logic. Apparently a pair of slacks could doom a marriage faster than infidelity. The articles also carried a sense of theatre. Imagine a fictionalized cautionary tale about a girl named Clara who dares to skip her sewing circle for an afternoon bicycle ride. By page 3, Clara is portrayed as selfish, reckless, perhaps even ill. By page 5, her mother is weeping, her fiancé is gone, and the neighborhood whispers. The moral lesson is clear. If you try to pedal toward independence, the wheels of fortune will run you over. And yet, you sense something else between the lines. These panics reveal more about the editor's anxieties than the reader's choices. The louder the warnings grew, the clearer it became that young women were changing, testing boundaries, daring to imagine a life beyond obedience. The panic pages are almost like smoke alarms, shrill because something real was burning outside the glossy walls. Picture yourself as a teenager in 1928, sneaking a look at one of these articles while wearing a beaded headband your mother disapproves of. The magazine's thunderous warnings don't frighten you, they irritate you, maybe even amuse you. You roll your eyes at the notion that lipstick spells doom, and you secretly vow to go to another dance anyway. The page has tried to scare you back into line, but instead it's given you a thrill of rebellion. That paradox, control through fear, rebellion through laughter, makes the moral panic pages so fascinating. They reveal a culture straining to hold its grip, trying to shout down the very changes it could no longer ignore. And now, as you close this issue in your imagination, you hear the faint clatter of typewriters and the click of worried editors stapling warnings to every page. Their panic is loud, but your eyelids are heavy. The sound fades, leaving behind the image of headlines trembling like anxious voices, terrified that young women might trade obedience for jazz, trousers, or, worst of all, the right to say no. The scolding headlines fade into silence, and when the next glossy spread opens, you're met not with dire warnings, but with glittering smiles. Here come the celebrity wives, famous names and carefully posed portraits that beam like lanterns from the page. They are actresses, singers, socialites, and sometimes simply the wives of important men, each displayed as proof that obedience pays off. Their hair is always neat, their dress is impeccable, their husbands photographed nearby with approving expressions, as though the true achievement is not fame, but keeping a famous man content. Mainstream historians point out that by the early to mid-20th century, women's magazines increasingly filled their pages with profiles of celebrity marriages. These weren't just light gossip, they were models, lessons, templates. By presenting wealthy, stylish wives as paragons of charm and loyalty, editors offered readers a living illustration of how obedience could look glamorous. You didn't just keep house, you kept it like Mrs. Movie Star did, with matching curtains, a bright smile, and the occasional recipe he loves best. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some celebrity profiles included direct quotes from husbands praising their wives for being modest, supportive, or never questioning. One Hollywood actor in the 1930s was quoted as saying his wife's best role is her role at home. You can almost hear yourself chuckle. Imagine a red carpet interview today where the actor leans into the mic and says, "She's really good at ironing." Historians still argue whether these profiles were harmless fluff or cultural weapons. Were they simply entertainment, or were they carefully engineered to reinforce the link between obedience and reward? If the glamorous wives seemed content, readers might conclude obedience wasn't just survival, it was the fast track to happiness, even sparkle. Picture yourself flipping through a 1940s issue and seeing a glossy spread. How Mrs. Smith keeps him smiling. The photographs show her pouring coffee at a breakfast table, arranging flowers, and gazing admiringly at her husband as though he just invented toast. The captions hum with subtext, "Her greatest joy is supporting his career," or "She balances her own interests with the duties of wifehood, always placing him first." You might smirk, imagining her muttering under her breath after the photo shoot. Balance? Sure, if balance means holding up the whole seesaw. The celebrity wives also functioned like advertisements themselves. If a famous couple was shown cooking with a particular brand of flour or soap, readers linked the product not only to domestic success, but to marital success. The message was cunning. If you buy the soap, maybe your husband will smile at you the way Mr. Famous smiles at Mrs. Famous. Consumerism and obedience fused under the warm glow of celebrity glamour. Yet between the glossy photographs, you catch shadows. Not every celebrity marriage was perfect, and sometimes the cracks showed. Whispered rumors of affairs or divorces contradicted the carefully staged articles. Readers, sharp as they were, must have noticed the gaps. Some may have clipped the pictures for inspiration, while others raised an eyebrow and thought, if even she can't keep him happy, maybe it's not just about polishing shoes. The tension lingers. Celebrity wives as icons, celebrity wives as illusions. You can imagine readers writing in, half admiring, half skeptical. One might gush, "If only I could manage my household as gracefully as Mrs. So-and-so." While another might roll her eyes at captions so syrupy they made the tea taste sweet. Still, the pages carried weight. They suggested that obedience could be glamorous, that supporting a husband could win applause, that even fame itself was secondary to marital loyalty. And you, drifting deeper into the story, can almost hear the faint click of a camera shutter, freezing another smile into permanence, even if it was painted on. As the magazine closes, the celebrity wives remain there, grinning eternally from the glossy page. They are trophies, cautionary tales, role models, and illusions all at once. And the message seeps in softly. If the stars themselves obey, surely you should too. The glossy grin of celebrity wives fades, and when the next page turns, the voice that greets you is heavier, older, steeped in incense and sermons. Advice from clergymen fills the columns, printed in polite black ink, their words dressed as guidance, but carrying the firm weight of doctrine. Imagine sitting in your parlour, tea cooling at your side, as a minister's voice seems to float from the page, reminding you that submission isn't just etiquette, it's divine law. Mainstream historians remind us that women's magazines often partnered with religious leaders, reprinting sermons or publishing short homilies about the duties of wives. Ministers penned articles on the sanctity of obedience, stressing that a wife who contradicted her husband contradicted God's plan itself. The message was blunt. The home was a little church, the husband its priest, the wife its devoted congregation. Now for the quirky tidbit. One late 19th century magazine actually printed a column called The Pastor's Corner, which gave weekly, scripture-based advice for wives. One issue solemnly insisted that a wife's tone of voice when greeting her husband sets the spiritual climate of the home. You might smile wryly, imagining a poor woman whispering amen every time she hands over his slippers. Historians still argue whether these printed sermons truly reinforced obedience or simply mirrored the sermons women already heard in church on Sundays. Did the magazines amplify clerical power, or were they just another echo chamber for beliefs already deeply rooted in society? The debate, like so many others, remains unresolved, circling around the question of whether print created control or simply embroidered it with fancier borders. Picture yourself with one of these issues in hand in 1900. You read an article titled The Wife's Holy Calling. It explains gently but firmly that obedience is a form of worship, that silence in the face of a husband's temper is a sign of grace, and that patience is the highest feminine virtue. You feel your chest tighten because suddenly your own daily chores aren't just duties, they're sacred rituals. Dusting isn't housekeeping, it's liturgy. Baking bread isn't just nourishment, it's a prayer. Some sermons went further, warning wives against dangerous ambition. A woman who desired education, independence, or leadership risked not just her marriage but her soul. To study too hard, one preacher suggested, was to risk unsexing oneself, a phrase so strange you almost laugh. Joke 1, you imagine a woman finishing a book on philosophy only for her husband to gasp, "Good heavens, you've misplaced your femininity between chapters." The clergyman's tone often had a rhythm, soothing and scolding at once, much like a lullaby sung slightly off-key. They promised eternal harmony if wives obeyed, and eternal chaos if they strayed. It was carrot and stick, but wrapped in velvet scripture. And to a reader balancing her faith with her fatigue, the effect could be profound. Still, some women must have noticed the contradictions. Letters occasionally slipped through with sly wit, asking if it was truly holy for a husband to demand roast beef every Sunday. One editor, flustered, printed the reply, "Sacrifice is the wife's crown." Joke 2, you imagine the woman rolling her eyes and muttering, "Then I suppose potatoes are my halo." The sermons also reveal a cultural balancing act. By publishing religious voices, magazines cemented their moral authority. They weren't just selling recipes or corsets, they were shaping souls. The kitchen table became an altar, the apron became vestments, and every small act of deference could be catalogued as piety. But even here you find hints of rebellion. A quiet counterpoint emerges in some issues, profiles of women missionaries or charity leaders whose obedience stretched into leadership. The message was slippery: you may lead, but only if framed as service. Historians still debate whether this opened the door for more independence or simply gilded the chains of submission. Now, as you turn the final page of the Clergyman's Counsel, the sermons fade back into silence. The ink lingers like incense, heavy and faintly sweet, reminding you that for generations, wives were told obedience wasn't just social, it was sacred. And you, drifting towards sleep, can almost hear the echo of a hymn, soft, insistent, urging wives to kneel politely before the altar of their husband's authority. The scent of incense fades, and with a sudden clang, you're swept into the clatter of factory whistles, marching boots, and ration cards. The war years have arrived, and so have the magazines that coached women on how to obey in new, patriotic ways. Flip through a 1917 issue during the First World War, or a 1942 issue during the Second, and you'll find spreads teaching wives how to keep their homes orderly, their spirits high, and their obedience redirected toward doing their part. Only now, obedience wasn't just about pleasing a husband, it was about pleasing the nation. Mainstream historians remind us that wartime women's magazines were thick with propaganda. They featured recipes for victory meals that used fewer rations, sewing patterns for reusing fabric, and cheery articles reminding wives not to complain if husbands returned late from war work, or not at all. The message was clear: patience and submission at home were patriotic duties. Here's the quirky tidbit. One American magazine during World War II actually published model letters wives could send to their soldier husbands. They included lines like, "I am keeping cheerful and waiting faithfully, so you need not worry about me." Imagine being coached not only in how to scrub floors, but in how to shape your very affection into an obedient morale booster. Joke 1, you think of it as emotional rations, carefully portioned, so no soldier got too much sass with his socks. Historians still argue whether these magazines genuinely empowered women by giving them new responsibilities, or whether they simply reframed obedience in khaki and red, white and blue. Did the war years expand women's roles, or did they only stretch the leash temporarily, ready to snap back once peace returned? The debate continues, sometimes heatedly, as if scholars themselves are still rationing truth. Picture yourself in 1943, flipping open Good Housekeeping. You read instructions for making a casserole with powdered eggs and canned meat, alongside an article urging wives to keep a cheerful front for their men overseas. The tone insists that sacrifice at home equals victory abroad. You can almost see a tired woman stirring a thin pot of stew while the magazine whispers, "Smile, it's for the flag." And then the imagery widens. Photographs show women planting victory gardens, proudly holding baskets of beans and carrots. They look strong, but the captions remind them this strength is temporary until our men return. Joke 2. You imagine a carrot raising its leafy top like a tiny green flag, the unsung hero of democracy. The pressure to obey extended beyond the kitchen. Articles coached wives on keeping letters upbeat, on avoiding gossip that might lower morale, and on conserving luxuries so soldiers abroad wouldn't feel neglected. Even emotions were rationed. Sorrow was permitted, but anger or resentment was labelled selfish. The magazine became a drill sergeant in lace, barking orders softly but persistently. Obey your husband, obey your ration book, obey your nation. And yet resistance simmered. Some women wrote letters asking if it was unpatriotic to resent the double burden of factory work and housework. Editors replied with platitudes. Remember, every extra shift is a gift of loyalty. Joke 3 slides in. You imagine a sarcastic wife replying, "Sure, but can loyalty also do the dishes?" Still, there's no denying the war years gave many women new tastes of independence, running households alone, managing finances, even working in factories. The magazines tried to frame all of this as obedience to the nation, but the reality was more complicated. Once you've welded a plane wing or balanced a budget, it's hard to unlearn that competence. Historians still wrestle with this tension. Were magazines containing rebellion or inadvertently fueling it? As the war pages close, you hear the faint sound of a typewriter tapping out ration-friendly recipes and cheerful slogans. The ink smells faintly of metal and starch, and you, resting in the quiet, realize that obedience during wartime was painted as noble sacrifice. Yet under that patriotic veneer lay the same refrain you've been hearing all along. Obey your role, obey the script, obey the story written not by you, but for you. The roar of factories quiets, the banners come down, and with a weary sigh, the war ends. But the glossy pages don't celebrate women's newfound independence. They usher them straight back to kitchens, nurseries, and sewing rooms. You turn a page in 1946 and the message is unmistakable. The victory is won, now return to your rightful place. It's a pivot as sharp as a heel click on a parade ground. The magazines that had once praised women for riveting planes and balancing budgets now serenade them with casseroles and curtains, insisting the real triumph lies in servitude at home. Mainstream historians agree that post-war magazines played a central role in reconstructing gender roles. Governments and advertisers feared social disruption if women stayed in factories, so print culture helped redomesticate them. Articles praised the joys of homemaking and profiled women who gave up wartime jobs happily to tend children. The subtext was clear. The country needed obedient wives as much as it once needed obedient workers. Here's a quirky tidbit. One 1947 magazine cover featured a radiant wife in pearls holding a mop like a scepter with the headline, "Home Your Kingdom." You can't help but laugh softly because if a mop is a crown, then spilled soup is a royal uprising. Historians still argue whether women actually believed these glossy instructions or whether they played along while quietly resenting the retreat. Did magazines genuinely succeed in corralling millions back into kitchens, or did they simply reflect the nostalgia of male editors and advertisers? Some scholars see the 1950s housewife ideal as a cultural mirage, pretty, polished, but never fully real. Imagine a woman in 1952 reading Ladies' Home Journal while folding laundry. The article in her lap insists she can find renewed joy in polishing silver, that her husband's success is her true achievement. She sighs, remembering the wartime days when she earned her own wages and made her own decisions. The socks in her hands feel heavier than they should because they carry the weight of expectation stitched into every page of the magazine. The content grows relentless. Tips on redecorating aren't just about curtains, they're framed as ways to create a haven so husbands never stray. Recipes for company dinners insist a wife's pride is in his compliments. Even parenting advice often circles back to how well a mother's obedience reinforces her husband's authority. It's like the entire post-war domestic revival was built on a looped soundtrack: smile, serve, obey. Of course, not everyone nodded along. Some readers sent letters asking why the magazines no longer featured working women. Editors, nervous, responded that true satisfaction lay in family life. Others slipped humour into their comments. One joked that her kingdom came with too many socks in revolt. You smile at the image, a mop queen battling a sock rebellion in her laundry room throne. Advertisers also leaned hard into the return to the kitchen script. Appliance ads boomed, promising easier chores with new washing machines and ovens. But the subtext was still obedience. Technology didn't free women, it bound them more efficiently to domestic duty. The sparkling refrigerator wasn't liberation, it was a shinier cage. The cultural shift had bite. When women who wanted to stay in paid work were criticized, magazines often carried the scolding tone. Children thrive best when mothers are at home. Translation: obedience wasn't just for husbands anymore, it was for society at large. Picture yourself closing the magazine with a sigh, standing in that 1950s kitchen where pastel appliances hum like docile servants. The walls are cheerful, the curtains freshly pressed, and yet the silence is heavy. You feel the push of glossy pages on your shoulders, nudging you back toward a destiny you never asked for. And so the post-war pivot becomes clear. The battlefield shifted from the factory floor to the living room, but the command remained the same: obey. Only now the orders were delivered in satin fonts and full-color spreads, as soft and insistent as a lullaby, guiding wives back into kitchens they never really left. The pastel kitchens fade, but the glossy pages keep turning, and suddenly a new kind of voice slides into the magazines. It's calm, clinical, and full of jargon. Words like adjustment, contentment, emotional hygiene. Psychologists have entered the chat, and their tidy columns look less like sermons or scolding tips, more like professional advice. Yet beneath the veneer of modern science, the refrain remains familiar. Wives who obey are healthy, wives who question are maladjusted. Mainstream historians note that by the 1950s and 1960s, psychology became one of the most influential voices in women's magazines. Articles promised insight into the female mind, and self-help style quizzes peppered the pages. The scientific tone gave old lessons a new costume. Obedience was reframed not as divine will, but as mental wellness. Harmony at home was declared essential for avoiding nervous strain, and the best way to ensure harmony, of course, was to smile, support, and submit. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some mid-century magazines printed short case studies of imaginary wives with supposed psychological troubles. One, Mrs. A, felt restless and irritable. The diagnosis? She lacked feminine adjustment. The cure? Rededicate herself to household duties and rediscover fulfillment in serving her family. You can almost chuckle at the absurdity. If Freud had been hired as a magazine columnist, he might have prescribed vacuuming as therapy. Joke 1 lands neatly. Imagine billing your husband for psychological services rendered every time you fold his socks. Historians still argue whether these psychological features reflected real concern for women's well-being or were just clever rebrandings of obedience culture. Were wives being genuinely helped, or were they being managed with new vocabulary? The debate hums on, a tug-of-war between interpretations of empowerment and control. Picture yourself in 1961 leafing through a magazine article titled, "Is Your Marriage Mentally Fit?" It asks questions like, do you respect his judgment above your own? And do you find happiness in meeting his needs? If you answer no too often, the article warns, you may be courting neurosis. You sigh, realizing the quiz isn't measuring your mental health, it's measuring your obedience. The blending of psychology and advertising made the pressure even stronger. A soap ad might claim not only to keep you fresh, but also to restore harmony in marriage. A vacuum brand might promise peace of mind. Even aspirin ads implied that headaches could vanish if wives stopped resisting their roles. Joke 2 sneaks in. You picture an ad that reads, "Husband's approval, now available in chewable tablets." Letters poured into these psychology columns, some heartfelt, some skeptical. One woman confessed she felt trapped at home, only to be told she was resisting natural feminine rhythms. Another admitted she loved her job outside the house but was advised to treat it as secondary to her true calling. And occasionally a cheeky reader slipped through with sarcasm, asking if there was a pill for boredom while ironing. The editor's prim reply, "A cheerful outlook is the best cure." But beneath the humor lies the weight. Psychology was powerful because it sounded objective. Unlike sermons or etiquette rules, it claimed the authority of science. A wife who bristled at submission could now be diagnosed as unstable, selfish, or maladjusted. The chains were invisible, wrapped in clinical terms that made disobedience sound like illness. Imagine closing one of those magazines and staring at your reflection in the oven door. You wonder, am I tired because I've ironed 3 shirts? Or am I maladjusted? The question lingers, heavier than any casserole. As the pages close, the clinical voice fades to a murmur, but the echo remains. Obedience framed as therapy, submission as sanity. And you, drifting closer to sleep, hear the hum of jargon, soft, insistent, reassuring and stifling all at once, like a lullaby sung in the language of science. The calm drone of psychological advice slips away, and the next pages burst with diagrams and little sketches, forks lined up just so, napkins folded like lilies, and step-by-step instructions for setting a table worthy of royalty. These are the etiquette avalanche pages, the glossy landslides of rules that taught wives not only how to polish silver, but how to polish themselves into perfect obedience. Mainstream historians tell us that mid-20th century women's magazines were obsessed with etiquette. They framed manners not just as social polish, but as moral duty, especially for wives. A crooked fork wasn't merely clumsy, it hinted at poor character. Forgetting to stand when a guest entered, practically an indictment of your husband's reputation. Through endless diagrams and rules, women were told to stage manage every dinner party like a Broadway show, with obedience to custom as the star performance. Now for the quirky tidbit. One magazine in the 1950s actually printed a fold-out party etiquette chart that looked like a board game. Squares included things like offer your husband the first portion, move ahead 2 spaces, or interrupt his story, go back to start. You laugh softly because it reads like Candyland, except the prize at the end is marital harmony instead of a gumdrop castle. Joke 1. You imagine Milton Bradley pitching the obedience game at a toy fair, complete with tiny apron-shaped playing pieces. Historians still argue whether etiquette manuals empowered women by giving them social tools or trapped them in invisible cages. Was etiquette a ladder, letting women climb into respectability, or a leash, keeping them tethered to endless rules? The debate runs like a dinner bell, clear, loud, and impossible to ignore. Picture a 1930s housewife preparing for her in-laws' visit. She consults her magazine's illustrated chart to be sure the soup spoons are correctly placed. The article warns, a poorly laid table reflects poorly on a husband's standing. She trembles slightly, not because her soup will be cold, but because a crooked knife might stain his reputation. Imagine sweating over silverware like it's a final exam, forks as essay questions, napkins as multiple choice. The avalanche didn't stop at table manners. Articles prescribed how to address a husband in public, speak with warmth, never correction, how to accept compliments, with modest thanks, not pride, and how to excuse oneself gracefully without causing disruption. Every gesture became performance. Obedience wasn't demanded by shouting, it was embedded in the choreography of etiquette. And sometimes the rules tipped into the absurd. One column advised that wives should never laugh louder than their husbands in company, as it might draw attention away from his wit. Joke 2. You picture a dinner party where a wife clamps her hand over her mouth mid-giggle, trying to muffle herself like a squeaky accordion. Another guide insisted women should always practice graceful listening, which essentially meant perfect stillness while men spoke. That's less etiquette, more statue impersonation. The endless rules also made obedience self-policing. If you're constantly worried about the angle of a salad fork or the timing of a polite smile, you don't have much energy left for questioning bigger structures, and that, of course, was the point. The avalanche of etiquette buried rebellion beneath a mountain of tiny, exhausting details. Yet some women found humor in it. Letters to editors occasionally teased the rigidity. If I use the wrong dessert spoon, will my husband truly lose face or just his pudding? Editors replied with solemn seriousness, missing the joke entirely. Joke 3. You imagine an etiquette expert drafting a police ticket. Citation. Excessive laughter. Fine payable in apologies. As you close the etiquette section in your imagination, the pages rustle like stiff linen napkins. The diagrams fade, leaving behind the echo of clinking silverware and whispered instructions. And you, half dreaming now, can feel the quiet weight of how something as small as a spoon could be turned into a lesson on obedience. The napkin diagrams fold away, and suddenly the paper smells faintly of fresh paint and new asphalt. You glance around and realize the magazine has carried you into suburbia, the 1950s dream neighborhoods, where identical houses line the street like dominoes and glossy magazines slide through every mailbox. The headlines sparkle with pastel optimism. The suburban ideal, your perfect family home. But behind the smiling housewives holding pies in driveways, you notice the same old script, obedience, now repackaged, with white fences and automatic washing machines. Mainstream historians often point out that suburbanization after World War II went hand in hand with women's magazines. The publications didn't just report the shift, they actively shaped it. Features promoted ranch-style homes, open-plan kitchens and modern appliances, but always with the reminder that a wife's main role was to maintain the home and keep her husband happy. The suburbs were sold not just as living spaces, but as obedience playgrounds, little domestic kingdoms where women ruled, only if they ruled quietly. Here's a quirky tidbit. One 1950s spread gave decorating tips for his den. The article earnestly advised wives to honor your husband's space by not rearranging his books or placing frivolous knickknacks nearby. You grin at the image of a man in slippers defending his ashtray from a rogue vase. Joker 1, you imagine a police line of tiny porcelain figurines being marched out of the room for disturbing his masculine peace. Historians still argue whether suburban magazines reflected genuine aspirations or imposed them. Were women truly enchanted by the dream of two-car garages and Tupperware parties? Or did magazines simply spin the narrative to keep them content in isolation? The debate is ongoing, much like the rows of cul-de-sacs stretching endlessly outward. Picture yourself flipping through a 1957 issue while sitting in a brand new suburban kitchen. The article titled "Creating Harmony in the Home" tells you that fresh curtains, punctual dinners, and a cheerful smile will set the tone for your husband's success. Outside, kids ride bicycles, sprinklers hiss, neighbors mow their identical lawns. The message is unmistakable. Conformity is comfort, and comfort is obedience. The suburban spread also glorified efficiency. Charts listed how many minutes each chore should take: 10 to dust, 15 to vacuum, 20 to prepare a roast. These schedules weren't just time-saving tricks. They were obedience scripts disguised as productivity hacks. Joke 2, you picture a stopwatch dangling around your neck while you dash from stove to laundry basket, as if competing in the Olympics of submission. Advertisements leaned heavily into the suburban fantasy. Fridge brands promised peace of mind if you kept it stocked just right. Tupperware was marketed not just as storage, but as proof of your organization and loyalty. Even lawnmowers were framed as family investments in his happiness. Every purchase reinforced the idea that the suburban wife's worth was measured in how seamlessly she served. And yet, behind the neat lawns, women wrote letters to the magazines confessing loneliness. One wrote, "Sometimes I feel my house is more a cage than a dream." Another admitted she looked forward to the postman's visit just to talk to someone. Editors usually responded with gentle scoldings. Remember, joy comes from gratitude. Joke 3. You imagine a postman carrying not letters, but therapy sessions in his satchel. The suburban ideal was glossy on the outside, but hollow in the middle. Magazines sold it as paradise, yet many women experienced it as silence, a silence filled with chores, conformity, and unspoken discontent. As the pages close, you see a neat street stretching into the distance, every house identical, every smile rehearsed. The hum of sprinklers blends with the faint rustle of the magazine, lulling you further, and you realize the suburbs, for all their newness, carried the same old command: obey quietly or risk spoiling the dream. The sprinkler hum fades, and now the magazine opens to something light-hearted at first glance. Little boxes with bold titles like, "Is your marriage happy?" or "Do you please him enough?" These are the quizzes, half entertainment, half trap, where wives were invited to check boxes and tally scores. The tone was playful, almost flirty, but the answers were rigged. No matter how you filled them out, the moral was the same. A happy marriage meant obedience, and if yours wasn't happy, you probably weren't obeying enough. Mainstream historians note that these quizzes became a staple of women's magazines from the 1920s onward. They gave readers a sense of participation, a break from passive reading. But their real purpose was subtle conditioning, teaching wives to measure themselves by their husband's satisfaction. Instead of asking what she wanted, the questions always pivoted to him. Now for the quirky tidbit. One 1950s quiz actually asked, when your husband is late for dinner, do you A. complain, B. sulk, or C. keep his plate warm with a smile? The correct answer, of course, was C. You chuckle softly because clearly the only wrong option missing is D. eat the dinner yourself and buy a dog. Joke 1 lands easily in your head. Historians still argue whether women treated these quizzes seriously or with amusement. Did they really score themselves anxiously, or did they giggle with friends over the absurd questions? Maybe both. Perhaps the quiz worked like a horoscope. Some read it as gospel, others as gossip, but all absorbed the framework. Picture yourself in 1938, pencil in hand, taking one of these tests at the kitchen table. A question reads, "Do you allow your husband to win arguments to preserve harmony?" You pause, the pencil hovering. The options aren't really options. They're coded reminders. Even your silence in the moment feels like a confession. You tally the points, and at the end, the result declares, "You are a devoted wife, though a bit too quick to criticize. Try softer tones." You sigh, realizing that no matter how many answers you choose, the quiz never lets you win. Some were sillier still. A 1960s quiz asked, "Do you look as fresh in the evening as you do in the morning?" As though ironing all day somehow doubles as a spa treatment. Joke 2, you picture yourself covered in flour and mop water, checking yes just to earn extra credit for surviving. The beauty of these quizzes, if beauty is the right word, was that they disguised obedience as self-reflection. Wives weren't being ordered to obey, they were being nudged into diagnosing themselves as deficient if they didn't. It was self-grading submission, a clever way to make women hold the red pen against their own lives. Some readers caught on. Letters occasionally teased the quizzes. "I scored only 42. Does that mean my husband should return me for a refund?" The editor's reply was prim. No score is final. Improvement is always possible with patience. Joke 3 practically writes itself. You imagine a husband presenting his wife at the customer service desk. She's only a 42. Can I exchange her for a 75? Yet beneath the humour, the effect was real. The quizzes reinforced the idea that a woman's happiness was inseparable from her husband's, that the only grade worth earning was his smile, that her obedience could be measured, tallied, and graphed like a school report card. As you close this section, the rustle of the quiz sheets fades, but you can almost hear the echo of pencils scratching, wives marking boxes late at night, wondering if they passed the test. The answers were always the same, the score preordained, and you, drifting into the quiet, realized these quizzes weren't about fun. They were obedience lessons disguised as games. The penciled quizzes fold away, their faint scratch still lingering in your ears, and suddenly the magazine opens onto something heavier. No cheerful fonts now, just paragraphs of tight text, letters written in desperate script, lines trembling between longing and despair. These are the confession pages where women poured out their loneliness, their confusion, their silent cries from behind glossy smiles. And as you read, you feel the weight of their voices pressing through the paper. Mainstream historians point out that women's magazines often encouraged these confession-style letters, printing carefully selected excerpts to show the struggles of ordinary wives. Some were real, others heavily edited, but all served a dual purpose. They gave women the illusion of being heard, while also reinforcing the same lessons. A lonely wife might admit she felt invisible, but the printed reply usually circled back to obedience. Try harder, smile more, serve better. Now for a quirky tidbit. In the 1930s, one magazine ran a column called Heart to Heart with the editor. A woman once wrote that she felt crushed by endless duty and unseen effort. The published reply? Your husband may not thank you aloud, but obedience is its own reward. You almost laugh at the cruel neatness of it, like telling someone who's starving that hunger is a virtue. Joke 1. You imagine an editor scribbling, try seasoning your silence with gratitude, tastes great on casseroles. Historians still argue whether printing these confessions helped or harmed. Did they offer comfort by showing women they weren't alone, or did they normalize suffering by wrapping it in the same old obedience bow? The debate is as tangled as the letters themselves, fluttering between empathy and manipulation. Picture yourself reading one such confession. In 1955, a woman admits she weeps at night, feeling unappreciated. She says her husband never notices her work, that her children barely acknowledge her. The editor responds, remember, true love is shown through sacrifice, not recognition. You fold the page with a sigh, the loneliness echoing like a hollow room. The advice doesn't comfort, it sanctifies her silence. Some confessions were startlingly blunt. One wife admitted she sometimes fantasized about leaving, about taking a train, and never looking back. The editor printed it but added a firm note. Wives who abandon their posts abandon their purpose. Joke 2. You imagine the train conductor leaning down to whisper, sorry ma'am, only rebellious tickets sold here. Magazine says no. Others were heartbreaking in quieter ways. A woman wrote that she dreaded Sundays because her husband read the newspaper all day and never spoke to her. The reply urged her to find joy in small tasks and be grateful for his steady presence. You can almost feel her folding the page with trembling hands, the silence louder than any headline. Yet in between the edits, the raw truth still slipped through. Readers saw themselves reflected in the loneliness. They recognized the fatigue, the invisibility, the yearning. The very act of reading another woman's confession might have offered a flicker of solidarity, even if the official response smothered it with obedience. Some wives responded with humor. A letter once quipped, "If my husband notices me only when dinner is late, perhaps I should be late more often." The editor scolded her, but you smile anyway because the joke has power. Joke 3. You imagine her deliberately burning toast just to start a conversation, her rebellion crisp and buttered. As you close this section in your mind, The letters fall silent, but their weight lingers. They remind you that behind every glossy ad and cheerful tip, there were women who felt unseen, unheard, undone. The magazine may have framed their despair as obedience lessons, but the voices themselves whispered something stronger, the cost of silence, printed in black and white. The sorrow of those confessions still lingers when the magazine shifts tone again, this time not for wives, but for daughters. A new section beams brightly with pastel fonts and playful illustrations, for girls only. At first, the pages sparkle with innocence, tips on choosing hair ribbons, gossip about school dances, advice on fitting in. But look closer, and you see the scaffolding. These weren't just tips for teenagers, they were training manuals, soft drills preparing girls for their future role as obedient wives. Mainstream historians often call this social grooming. From the 1910s through the 1960s, women's magazines added teenage supplements to hook young readers early. They blended pop culture, film stars, music, clothes, with subtle lessons about modesty, charm, and deference. By the time girls became brides, they had already absorbed years of glossy conditioning. Now, for a quirky tidbit, one 1940s teen corner feature included a checklist titled, "Are You Girlfriend Material?" Questions included, "Do you let boys win at games?" and "Do you always ask Dad's opinion before choosing a dress?" You laugh quietly, because apparently even Monopoly was a lesson in submission. Joke one lands here. You picture a girl deliberately losing at checkers, thinking, "Great, I'm securing my marriage prospects one pawn at a time." Historians still argue whether these teen supplements reflected genuine interest in youth culture or were simply an extension of adult anxieties. Were magazines simply giving girls a space to be playful, or were they laying rails that led directly into kitchens and nurseries? The answer is hazy, like pink lipstick smudged on the edge of a teacup. Picture yourself in 1958, a teenage girl sprawled on the floor with a glossy supplement. You giggle at the film star pin-ups, circle fashion tips in pencil, and then land on a column titled "Charm School at Home." It teaches you how to sit gracefully, how to speak in softer tones, and how to always let a boy take the conversational lead. You practice with your girlfriends, laughing at first until the lessons sink in. Charm becomes habit, and habit becomes obedience. The supplements also carried cautionary tales. A comic strip might show wild girls, those who wore skirts too short or danced too much, ending up embarrassed, abandoned, or alone. Meanwhile, the good girls, the ones who obeyed parents, smiled sweetly, and stayed modest, were rewarded with steady boyfriends and eventual marriage proposals. It was serialized fiction's little cousin, dressed in polka dots and bubble letters. Some of the advice was absurd in its earnestness. One column warned girls against appearing too intellectual at dates, lest boys feel threatened. Joke 2, you imagine a girl hiding her math homework under the table, whispering, "Don't worry, I only count when you're not looking." Another suggested practicing domestic skills early, noting that a tidy room is good rehearsal for a tidy home. Suddenly, even folding sweaters becomes a rehearsal for marital obedience, and yet, tucked between the lines, there were glimmers of genuine teenage life, notes about music, letters about crushes, excitement over dances. You can almost feel the tug-of-war. The magazines wanted to capture youthful energy while steering it into predictable channels. Girls learned to dream, but only within the pastel fences. Some readers wrote in rebelliously, asking whether a girl could choose college before marriage. Editors tread carefully, encouraging ambition as long as it didn't interfere with her future duties. Others teased the quizzes. "If I win at games and read books, am I doomed?" The replies tried to soften, but the undercurrent was firm. Obedience was the safest path. Joke 3. You picture a cartoon report card where the grades read, cooking, A+, listening, quietly, A+, thinking for yourself, needs improvement. As you close the teen section, the pastel ink lingers, smelling faintly of bubblegum and starch. You realize these glossy supplements weren't just playful extras, they were quiet rehearsals, teaching girls to step into roles already written for them. And as the pages fold shut, you sense that obedience didn't start at marriage. It was planted early, watered monthly, and bloomed in glossy ink long before the wedding vows. The pastel giggles of teen columns fade, and when the magazine opens again, the tone is hushed, almost conspiratorial. Between the fashion plates and etiquette charts, you spot something subtle, an essay about women pursuing art for self-expression, a short story where the heroine works part-time by choice, or even a quiet editorial suggesting that marriage works best when both partners listen. These are the moments when rebellion peeked in, when editors smuggled small doses of independence between the obedient lines, as if hiding contraband in a lace handkerchief. Mainstream historians acknowledge that even the most conservative women's magazines occasionally included articles that stretched the boundaries. Sometimes it was because editors sympathized with readers' frustrations. Sometimes it was simply market strategy, offering variety to keep subscriptions steady. But the effect was striking. Amid pages screaming, "Obey," you'd stumble upon a whisper that said, "Maybe you don't have to, not entirely." Now for the quirky tidbit. In the 1920s, one magazine ran a regular feature titled Women Who Do Things. Profiles included female aviators, writers, and explorers. The tone was careful, praising their accomplishments while reminding readers they were still wives or daughters at heart. But the mere inclusion was radical for the time. You smile, imagining a housewife in 1925 staring at a photograph of a woman flying a biplane, thinking, well, my husband did say not to leave the stove unattended, but what about the stratosphere? Joke 1 writes itself, a headline that should have read "Supper may burn, but so did the sky." Historians still argue whether these rebellious crumbs were intentional acts of resistance by editors or just a byproduct of shifting culture. Were magazines secretly helping women stretch their imaginations, or were they cynically cashing in on novelty while still pushing obedience overall? The debate has no neat conclusion, but the tension is undeniable. Picture a 1940s reader flipping through glossy pages after a long day of laundry. She stumbles on a short essay encouraging wives to pursue hobbies for their own happiness. The advice is framed cautiously: quilting, writing poetry, or volunteering. But the seed is there: for their own happiness. She pauses, the idea glowing faintly like a candle in the corner of her mind. Then the very next page scolds her for not polishing silver thoroughly. The push and pull must have been dizzying. These rebellious inclusions weren't loud revolutions, they were sly winks. A short story might feature a heroine who delays marriage until she finishes her schooling. A profile might show a female doctor praised for her compassion rather than her paycheck. Even advertisements sometimes slipped in sly independence, a typewriter ad showing a secretary looking just a little too satisfied at her desk. Joke 2, you imagine her typing, "Dear husband, I'm late because I'm busy being competent." Readers noticed, some wrote grateful letters. Your story about the woman who painted in her spare time inspired me to take up lessons. Others criticized, you encourage wives to neglect their true duties. Editors balanced carefully, letting just enough rebellion peek in to intrigue without alienating the core readership. And yet those glimpses mattered. Even one photograph of a woman in trousers, smiling confidently, could plant a thought that lingered longer than any casserole recipe. For some it was reassurance they weren't alone in craving more. For others, it was the first time they saw independence pictured as admirable, not shameful. As you close this section in your imagination, you can almost see the glossy pages blushing, caught between scolding and smuggling. The rebellion was never overt, never loud, but it was there, like a whispered joke at a solemn dinner, slipping past the rules to remind readers that obedience wasn't the only story being told. Joke 3 lingers as a smile. Rebellion may have been dressed in lace and careful footnotes, but it was rebellion nonetheless. The whispers of rebellion fold into silence, and now the magazine turns its own gaze inward. You find an editorial essay, its tone self-important, weighing the question aloud. Did magazines shape women or simply reflect them? It's an odd sensation, like hearing the mirror ask if it truly controls the face it reflects. Historians have been circling this debate for decades. Did these glossy pages actively train wives to obey? Or were they only parroting what society already demanded? Mainstream historians emphasize both sides. On one hand, magazines clearly acted as cultural engines, pumping out advice, sermons, stories, and ads that reinforced obedience. On the other hand, they also relied on readership. Too much pushback could sink circulation. They had to mirror what readers expected to see. It's a chicken and egg puzzle. Did the magazines create the obedient wife, or did the obedient wife create the magazines? Now for the quirky tidbit. One 1930s editor once boasted in print that her magazine both leads and follows, describing it as a compass that spins with society. You can't help but grin at the contradiction. If your compass spins, it's not a compass. Joke 1 writes itself. You imagine a housewife lost in the woods with her spinning compass deciding obedience must be north simply because the magazine says so. Historians still argue this endlessly, and not just in classrooms. Feminist scholars in the 1970s accused magazines of being indoctrination machines. Others countered that women often read them selectively, skipping or mocking the obedience content while enjoying the fashion, recipes, or genuine community. The truth, as always, is complicated, like a quilt stitched from scraps, each square showing a different piece of the story. Picture yourself in 1950, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the latest issues spread wide. On one page, you read an etiquette column scolding wives for correcting husbands. On another, you see a reader's letter joking about her husband burning the toast. You laugh at her wit, then frown at the editor's prim reply. Do you take the magazine seriously or roll your eyes? The answer depends on you, and millions of women made that choice every month, consciously or not. Sometimes magazines worked as conversation starters rather than command books. A woman might clip a recipe but ignore the sermon beside it. She might chuckle at a quiz but not grade herself harshly. In those choices, readers bent the pages to their own needs. Joke 2, you picture a wife cutting out only the cake recipe and tossing the obedience sermon straight into the kindling pile. Obedience goes up in smoke, chocolate cake stays. And yet, the influence is undeniable. Advertising, etiquette, fiction, letters, sermons, they all hummed the same tune so consistently that it became background noise. When every page, in one way or another, suggested obedience, even the most skeptical reader absorbed some of it. Like wallpaper, it faded into the background but shaped the atmosphere of the room. You wonder then if the debate even has an answer. Maybe it doesn't matter whether magazines led or followed, because, in practice, they did both. They were mirrors, yes, but also amplifiers. They took the whispers of culture and printed them in bold fonts, making quiet norms louder, shinier, harder to ignore. As you close this reflective section, you hear the faint hum of scholarly arguments, some stern, some sympathetic, all still circling the spinning compass. And you, drifting deeper, realize the truth is slippery. The magazines were both stage and audience, both echo and conductor, both cage and quilt. Joke 3 flickers softly. You think of the magazines themselves filling out a quiz. Do you lead culture? A. Yes. B. No. C. Both, but don't tell anyone. Their score, predictably, is obedience. The scholarly hum fades and the pages open to a storm. Bold headlines, urgent essays, photographs of marches and letters brimming with fury. It is the late 1960s and the feminist wave is cresting high. Women's magazines, once obediently humming lullabies of submission, now face thunder outside their glossy walls. The tone is unsettled, even panicked. The world is changing, and the old script of obedience is under siege. Mainstream historians note that the second-wave feminist movement collided directly with women's magazines. Activists accused them of enslaving women in kitchens and beauty routines. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 famously called suburban housewives the problem with no name, and her criticism landed like a slap across every pastel cover. Suddenly, the magazines that once defined womanhood found themselves accused of betraying it. Now for the quirky tidbit. In 1970, members of the group Women's Liberation famously stormed the offices of Ladies' Home Journal in New York, occupying the space for hours and demanding editorial control. They wanted the magazine to cover topics like workplace discrimination, childcare, and reproductive rights, not just casseroles and corsets. Imagine the scene: typewriters clicking in protest, editors sweating as women rearranged the office furniture. Joke 1. You picture a rebellious protester taping a note to the fridge ad in the next issue. This machine keeps food cold, not women. Historians still argue whether the feminist storm truly transformed magazines or just forced them to rebrand. Some titles, like Ms., were born out of outright rebellion, offering unapologetically feminist content. Others, like Good Housekeeping or Ladies' Home Journal, tried to adapt, mixing traditional content with cautious nods to independence. The result was uneven, sometimes comical. One issue might feature an article on 5 ways to obey with grace, and the next might feature Women in the Workplace, Is It Time? The glossy world was scrambling, its tone fractured. Picture yourself flipping through a 1972 issue. On one page, an ad still promises a vacuum that will keep your marriage tidy. On the next, a feature interviews a female lawyer about juggling career and family. The juxtaposition is dizzying, obedience and independence sharing the same coffee table. It feels like a cultural tug-of-war printed in 2 columns. The storm also exposed the cracks in readership. Older subscribers wrote angry letters. "Why must you encourage rebellion in my daughter?" While younger readers wrote the opposite. "Why are you still printing recipes as if that's all we do?" Editors tried to appease both, but in the process, they often created bizarre hybrids. Joke 2. You imagine a 1970s cover line screaming, "How to bake a pie," while demanding equal pay. The feminist wave also redefined what counted as obedience. Some articles began urging husbands to support their wives' new ambitions, flipping the script so slightly that it almost felt radical. But the undercurrent remained. The magazines still wanted harmony, still wanted to smooth edges, still wanted obedience, just redistributed across the household. And yet the storm mattered. The sheer force of feminist critique forced women's magazines to evolve. They could no longer pretend obedience was the only path. Independence had entered the conversation, and though it came wrapped in compromises and contradictions, it stayed. As you close this issue in your imagination, you hear the rumble of protests outside the glossy walls, the chants mixing with the soft shuffle of recipes inside. The feminist storm had rattled the pages, scattering old scripts like leaves in the wind. And you, drifting deeper, can still feel the tension, obedience cracking, rebellion rising, the glossy world scrambling to survive the weather. Joke 3 lingers. You imagine the magazines clutching umbrellas labeled tradition, trying to stay dry while the rain of equality pours down. The chants and placards of the feminist storm echo faintly as the magazine pages shuffle forward, nervously straightening their hems. Editors sit at desks with furrowed brows, pencils tapping, asking themselves the new survival question: how do you keep readers when the old sermons sound outdated? The answer arrives in glossy compromise. They scramble, rebranding obedience in fresher packaging, softly mixing words like empowerment with the same old lessons in submission. Mainstream historians call this the adaptation era. From the mid-1970s onward, traditional women's magazines tried to court both sides, the loyal readers who still wanted homemaking guidance, and the younger audience demanding independence. The result? A peculiar hybrid where a feature on how to ask for a raise might be followed by 10 ways to keep him happy at home. It was like watching the magazine walk a tightrope in heels. Here's a quirky tidbit. One 1977 issue of Ladies' Home Journal ran an article celebrating women finding themselves through hobbies, while the very next page featured an ad that declared, "A woman's truest joy is seeing him smile over supper." You can almost hear the editorial team sighing. Empowerment sells issues, but obedience still pays the advertisers. Joke 1, you picture a wife announcing proudly, "I found myself," while holding a casserole dish like a birth certificate. Historians still argue whether these scrambled edits were progress or backpedaling. Did the mix of empowerment and obedience genuinely reflect women's complex lives? Or was it a bait and switch, keeping readers on the hook while never fully letting go of control? The debate plays like two radio stations bleeding into each other. The signal's never quite clear. Imagine yourself in 1981 flipping open a glossy issue on a quiet Sunday. The first article tells you to claim your space in the workforce, complete with smiling photographs of women at desks. You nod, encouraged. But the next column insists you should never neglect the small touches that keep a husband content. Suddenly the encouragement feels conditional, like being given wings only to be told to flap them indoors. The rebrand also leaned on a new buzzword, balance. Instead of demanding outright obedience, magazines urged women to balance career and family. Yet the scales were always tipped. The husband's needs weighed heavier. Empowerment became palatable only when it didn't disturb the domestic script. Joke 2. You picture a kitchen scale labeled career on one side, husband slippers on the other, the slippers always winning by a pound. Letters from readers revealed the contradictions. Younger women wrote, "Thank you for including stories of women with ambition," while older subscribers asked, "Why are you teaching our daughters to be disobedient?" Editors tried to soothe both, printing cheerful features like how to say no without upsetting him. It was obedience with lipstick, a performance dressed in the language of choice. Advertisements joined the scramble. Beauty brands began marketing themselves as tools of empowerment, lipstick as liberation, perfume as independence, while still whispering that the real prize was male approval. "Be yourself," the ad declared, "and he'll love you more." Joke 3. You imagine an ad for a vacuum promising clean floors, clean conscience, clean feminist cred. The editors weren't just scrambling for relevance, they were fighting to hold on to authority. For decades, magazines told women what to do. Now they had to pretend they were listening too. That uneasy balance produced a patchwork tone, part mentor, part cheerleader, part scold. As you close this section in your imagination, you can feel the tug-of-war stretching the glossy spine. The pages don't sing obedience as loudly as before, but they hum it under their breath, trying to harmonize with the new chorus of independence. And you, drifting drowsier now, hear both voices blending into a strange duet, one urging women forward, the other quietly tugging them back. The tightrope wobble of empowerment and obedience fades, and the magazine suddenly feels lighter in your hands. You flip to the back pages and find something quirky, almost playful. The advice columns that made you chuckle even as they scolded. These were the spaces where editors let their hair down, printing oddball tips, home remedies, and etiquette shortcuts that were half helpful, half comical. And yet, even here, amid the pickle juice cures and ironing advice, the old lesson shimmered faintly. Obedience tucked under the humor. Mainstream historians remind us that advice columns were among the most read features of women's magazines from the late 19th century onward. They promised quick fixes, witty responses, and relatable voices. Sometimes they addressed serious issues, marital strife, loneliness, but often they veered into the bizarre. Readers adored them because they felt personal, like chatting with a clever neighbor. But even the strangest tips often carried a moral. A wife who followed them was efficient, charming, and above all, compliant. Now for the quirky tidbit. One 1920s advice column seriously suggested drinking warm pickle juice as a cure for hiccups. Another advised ironing newspaper to freshen it before recycling for fire kindling. You can't help but laugh softly. Joke 1. You imagine a wife in curlers solemnly flattening yesterday's headlines while muttering, "Yes, dear, just sanitizing the morning news." Historians still argue whether these oddball tips were harmless entertainment or subtle training. Were wives laughing along, or did they internalize the message that even hiccups and kindling were arenas for obedience? The line is blurry, and maybe the truth is both jokes and chains tangled together. Picture yourself in 1949 reading an advice column titled "Little Secrets for a Smoother Day." One tip says, "Sprinkle talcum powder in shoes to keep your step light. Your husband will notice your cheerful energy." Another suggests, "Place a dab of perfume inside the oven before he returns, so the kitchen smells sweeter." You pause, eyebrow raised. Joke 2. You imagine him opening the oven, sniffing suspiciously. "Why does this roast smell like lavender?" Some advice columns leaned on absurd problem-solving. A reader once asked how to handle a husband who refused to fix a leaky faucet. The columnist replied, "Offer him his favorite dessert as encouragement and remind him gently that you depend on his strength." Translation? Bribe him with pie, then return to obedience. You chuckle at the thought of carrot cake as plumbing currency. And yet, the humor sometimes gave women a vent. Readers wrote in with sarcastic complaints that slipped through the editorial sieve. One teased, "If I iron his socks, will he notice I'm still cross with him?" The editor's prim reply, "Ironed socks never go unnoticed." Joke 3. You picture a husband proudly parading around in stiff, shiny socks like armor against marital discontent. Advice columns also revealed the contradictions of the magazines. On one page, women were told to be efficient, modern managers of the home. On the next, they were reminded to stay deferential, letting their husbands hold the reins. The result was absurdity, disguised as wisdom. And in those absurdities, the humor shone brightest. As you close the advice pages in your mind, you can almost hear the clinking of pickle jars and the hiss of an iron on newspaper. The laughter lingers, but so does the lesson. Even quirky tips were bent toward obedience. Obedience was the seasoning sprinkled on every cure, every shortcut, every household hack. And you, drifting further into drowsiness, realize the advice columns were the magazine's wink, a joke shared in print, a reminder that even in laughter, obedience was never far behind. The playful absurdities of pickle juice and perfumed ovens fade, and now the magazine spreads open into something slower, heavier, almost academic. You find pages filled with long essays and surveys, charts, polls, diagrams of domestic bliss. These are the social science features, the magazine's attempt to borrow authority from researchers and statisticians. And once again, the conclusion is familiar. Obedience wasn't just polite, it was proven. Mainstream historians note that from the 1930s onward, many women's magazines embraced social surveys and psychological jargon to frame their lessons in science. Articles cited studies about marital satisfaction, often with tiny or biased samples, but presented them with authority. A headline might read, 9 out of 10 husbands prefer obedient wives. Beneath the pseudo-data, the same old message thrummed, submission is not only traditional, it's quantifiable. Here's the quirky tidbit. One 1950s feature included a pie chart breaking down marriage success factors. The largest slice, bright pink, was labeled her cheerfulness. Only a tiny sliver, grey, nearly invisible, was his responsibility. You can almost laugh at the boldness. Joke 1. You picture a wife presenting the chart at dinner like a PowerPoint, announcing, "As you see, dear, I'm 90% of this marriage and you're the pie crust." Historians still argue whether these surveys were genuine attempts at social science or pure propaganda disguised as numbers. Were editors trying to educate women with research, or just borrowing the authority of science to give obedience a shinier costume? The debate rolls on, unresolved, like an abacus missing half its beads. Imagine flipping through a 1942 article titled "The Secret Science of a Happy Home." It cites a study of 50 couples concluding that wives who deferred to husbands reported higher satisfaction. The magazine prints it like gospel, ignoring that the wives likely filled out the surveys with their husbands looking over their shoulders. The science is shaky, but the headline beams with certainty. Proof that obedience brings joy. Some surveys took on absurd specificity. One asked men their favorite dinner dish, then concluded that wives who cooked it weekly had more stable marriages. Joke 2. You picture a poor husband trapped in eternal meatloaf purgatory, smiling weakly while his wife declares, "Science says so." Another poll asked women if they argued with their husbands. Those who said yes were told they were at risk for discontent. It was less science, more circular sermon. Readers occasionally poked holes. A letter once quipped, "If 9 out of 10 men prefer obedient wives, perhaps the 10th has already learned to cook for himself." The editor's reply dismissed it as flippant, but you know the joke landed. Joke 3 lingers in your mind. You imagine that 10th husband blissfully eating canned beans, free of pie charts and lectures. The power of these pseudo-scientific features lay not in accuracy but in tone. Numbers looked objective, graphs looked modern, and studies sounded irrefutable. A wife reading these pages might not believe every detail, but the overall effect was persuasive. Obedience wasn't just tradition or faith, it was verified. As you close this section, the charts blur into pastel wedges and crooked bar graphs, fading like chalk on a blackboard. The numbers dissolve, leaving only the echo of certainty, the comforting hum of proof. And you, slipping further into drowsiness, realize that even science was recruited into the glossy chorus, each statistic another note in the endless lullaby of obedience. The pastel pie charts fade, and the magazine grows suddenly glossy again. Big photographs, headlines, splashed in bright colors. Now the subject is not wives alone, but families, tidy nuclear units posed in living rooms, smiling in perfect harmony. This is the family values era of the late 1970s through the 1980s, where obedience wasn't just whispered to wives, but broadcast as the glue holding society together. Mainstream historians point out that during these decades, magazines echoed the political climate. As conservative voices in America and Britain championed traditional values, women's periodicals leaned into the theme. Articles celebrated the homemaker's central role, profiled successful marriages built on respect, and warned, again, that too much independence could unravel the family. In truth, it was obedience rebranded, stretched across couches and minivans, staged in family portraits. Here's the quirky tidbit. One 1984 article literally suggested creating obedience charts for the household, where children ticked boxes for chores while wives tracked supportive behaviors for husbands. You can't help but laugh softly. Imagine pinning your own checklist to the fridge. Smiled at his jokes? Check. Agreed with his opinion on the lawnmower? Check. Joke 1. You picture a wife handing herself a gold star for not sighing too loudly during dinner. Historians still argue whether these family value spreads represented a backlash against feminism or just a cultural swing back to comfort zones. Were they a reactionary clampdown or simply nostalgia dressed up in glossy photos? The debate hums on like a vacuum in the next room. Picture a 1982 issue showing a family gathered around a Sunday roast. The caption beams, "Her devotion sets the table for love." The husband carves meat, the children smile neatly, and the wife hovers like the conductor of harmony, silent, steady, obedient. The message is staged so carefully it almost looks like parody, yet it was presented as blueprint. The family values push wasn't only about articles, it seeped into ads too. A cereal commercial printed in the back pages claimed mothers who served their product were building the bonds of family. A detergent ad showed kids running into a husband's arms with the mother smiling in the background, her labor erased, her obedience shining through the spotless clothes. Joke 2, you imagine her muttering, "Yes, I'll just keep ironing my way into immortality." Readers weren't blind to the script. Some wrote in praising the comfort of family-centered content, while others bristled. A young mother wrote, "I'm exhausted. Your pages tell me to cherish every chore, but some days I just want to scream." The editor's reply was syrupy. "Remember, your quiet service is what makes home sweet." Translation: obedience disguised as love again. The irony, of course, is that the same issues often contained contradictions. Flip a few pages and you might find an article on balancing career and family. But even here, the advice bent toward obedience. Choose jobs that don't interfere with home life, arrange schedules around his needs, never let ambition overshadow love. It was independence, declawed and domesticated. And yet, amid the glossy family portraits, cracks appeared. Divorce rates were climbing, more women were working full-time, and younger readers increasingly tuned out. The magazines were staging obedience in high color, but reality was messy and unscripted. Joke 3. You picture a cover line that honestly read, "Families look perfect in photos, but dinner was cold by the time Dad sat down." As you close this family values section, the staged smiles fade, leaving behind the faint hum of a VCR in the background, a sitcom laugh track echoing from the living room. The glossy pages tried to frame obedience as the heart of love, but the edges were fraying. And you, sinking deeper into the hush, realized that even in full color, the message hadn't changed. It was still the same lullaby, only now sung in chorus, with the whole family smiling along. The glossy family portraits dissolve, their staged smiles flickering like fading light bulbs, and you feel the magazine reach its final chapter. It's the late 20th century sliding into the early 21st, and women's magazines are changing costumes once again. Gone are the sermons and corset ads. In their place, sleek fonts and empowered taglines. Be yourself. Find your voice. Live your best life. But if you squint, you still see the faint outlines of obedience lurking beneath the glossy veneer, hiding in the fine print of articles that promise freedom while quietly prescribing how to look, how to love, how to behave. Mainstream historians point out that by the 1990s and 2000s, the language of women's magazines had shifted dramatically. They adopted the rhetoric of choice, independence, and self-expression. Yet the structural core often remained the same. Articles still framed success around relationships, beauty, and domestic competence. A modern wife might be told she could pursue a career, but only if she also stayed slim, stylish, and ever attentive to her partner's happiness. Here's the quirky tidbit. A 1999 cover line blared, "How to be independent without pushing him away." You laugh softly, because apparently independence had to be wrapped in bubble wrap to keep husbands from bruising. Joke 1, you imagine an instruction manual titled "Freedom but Fragile, Handle with Care." Historians still argue whether this era marked real progress or just a sleeker form of control. Were magazines liberating women or simply rebranding obedience with shinier fonts? Some scholars insist the old submission was simply disguised as choice. Women were told they were free to decide, but only within boundaries drawn by beauty standards and romantic expectations. Picture yourself leafing through a glossy 2005 issue. On one page, you see an empowering profile of a CEO mother photographed in her office. On the next, a feature promises 10 ways to keep the spark alive. Hint, it starts with him. You sigh at the whiplash, realizing the pendulum still swings between freedom and obedience, back and forth like it always has. The advertising followed suit. Perfume campaigns declared women unstoppable, but always framed in the gaze of men watching approvingly. Diet ads preached confidence while showing wives glowing in their husbands' arms. Even home decor features hinted that a well-arranged living room was a sign of devotion. Joke 2, you picture a magazine quiz asking, "Is your wallpaper loyal enough?" Letters from readers in these decades showed a new complexity. Some celebrated the empowering stories, finally seeing women in leadership roles, finally hearing voices that weren't just submissive whispers. Others vented frustration at the contradictions. How can you tell me to love myself on one page and to change myself for him on the next? The editors rarely had answers, but the glossy pages kept humming, selling empowerment and obedience in the same breath. And here we are now, at the end of the long, glossy journey. You've walked through corset ads and etiquette charts, sermons and surveys, suburban dreams and feminist storms. Through it all, the chorus has shifted costumes, but never quite changed its tune. Whether dressed as piety, patriotism, science, or empowerment, the refrain remained: wives must obey. As the magazine closes in your imagination, the pages settle like a stack of old letters, their ink faint but persistent. The chorus quiets, the colors fade, and you're left with the soft whisper of history, how generations of women were taught obedience in pages that claimed to entertain, advise, and inspire. And now, in this final hush, the wind down begins. The words slow, stretching into longer, softer sentences, like waves rolling gently to shore. The frantic headlines and clattering typewriters dissolve into stillness. You picture a quiet room where the glossy magazines are stacked neatly on a shelf, their once loud voices muted into simple paper and ink. The covers no longer shout, the advice columns no longer scold, the ads no longer sparkle. They are only relics now, artifacts of a world that tried to script women's lives one printed page at a time. You let your breath deepen as though exhaling centuries of instructions, commandments, and contradictions. The women inside those pages, smiling wives, scolded daughters, obedient homemakers, fade gently into silhouettes, then into shadows, then into a soft blur. Their voices become quieter than whispers, quieter than the hum of a fan in the background, quieter even than your own heartbeat. And as you drift further, you imagine yourself walking past the shelves out into a night where no sermons or ads follow you. The sky is wide, the air is cool, and for the first time in a long while, there is no prescription, no checklist, no obedience demanded. Only quiet, only rest. Only the simple comfort of letting history dissolve into silence. Sleep comes slowly, kindly, like the turning of one last page. And in that turning, you are free.